Chapter 226. The second ordeal begins. Jake was already well equipped, but when he discovered many boxes full of ammunition of all types, he took the opportunity to replenish his supplies. He still had his old apartment to clear out, which was still on the same islet lost in the middle of a lake, but it was possible that a group of vagrants had already squatted and robbed it, just as he himself had ransacked a farm without the slightest restraint. Being already well equipped, he soon lost interest in the family armory, which was not worth the one at the New Earth Research Center. Not everyone was, however. Even though almost everyone had decent equipment, one could never be too careful. Based on his memories of his first ordeal, there was indeed little chance that this equipment could be taken to the ordeal world with them. But if their grandfather felt it was necessary, it was better to trust him. Jake himself was heavily equipped, ready for any unforeseen situation. He would kick himself if he was ever caught in a difficult situation for having chosen to travel light. Each of the participants in his family received a gun and an assault rifle if they didn't have one, and donned a bulletproof vest or protective gear for those lacking them. It was possible to guess at a glance who had never carried a gun, and it turned out that everyone except his Aunt Aurelie was perfectly comfortable with these weapons. He was much more pessimistic when he saw the teenager Tim playing with his new machine gun to impress his cousin Lily, but the gold medal went to Enya and Essia, who were caressing the barrel of their rifle with fascination. Cough, cough. Jake cleared his throat next to them to bring them back to the moment. They blushed slightly as they put away their new weapons, and when they saw that everyone was ready, Jake's grandfather motioned for them to follow after him again. The group walked through the city of the Oracle playground at a good pace until they reached one of the cobblestone squares surrounding the city where the orange cubes were located. All of them were accustomed to the procedure and disappeared after the old man and accompanied him through the meandering Oracle playground until they returned to the filtered air of an Oracle shelter. A night sky tinged with green, pink, and purple greeted them. The temperature was close to zero, and many moons and stars could be discerned through the translucent walls of the black cube. This Oracle shelter was located in a polar zone, and these colors in the sky came from the aurora borealis. Indifferent to the phenomenon, the old man headed without delay towards the pentagonal building containing the various halls. The layout of the Oracle buildings was completely identical to the Oracle shelter that Jake was used to, but more aliens were walking around inside the force field. Ignoring the misery of the refugees clustering together outside the force field to keep themselves warm, the group entered the player hall, where they found a spacious, cozy bar with a saloon atmosphere. Jake had never ventured deeper into the hall before, but their grandfather was clearly a regular there. He walked around the bar, ignoring the humanoid players squinting at them, and led them down a long corridor of a few hundred meters, at the end of which a huge red cube, comparable to the one he had seen in the Cyan Desert, was waiting for them. Jake had the lingering image in his mind of a red cube standing outdoors in the center of the pentagonal building, but this one was still inside the player hall. Another corridor allowed them to continue on their way, probably leading to more red cubes. This was much more convenient, since thanks to the many red cubes and their distribution, the space where they were located was not crowded with campers of all species as it was during his first ordeal. A few thousand mainly human-looking individuals were calmly waiting for the red cube to open up its doors to them. The old man serenely chose a free place, then stood with his arms folded and ramrod straight, awaiting the fateful moment as he stared at the enormous red cube. The rest of the group did the same, their breathing slowing down as they mentally conditioned themselves for the unknown ordeal that loomed before them. Eventually, at 8 o'clock sharp, the red cube began flashing wildly, flickering faster and faster with a shrill, war siren-like sound. Those waiting too close to the cube were expelled from the area by the Oracle drones patrolling the room to make way for the exiting players. A few minutes later, the light from the red cube stabilized and a first wave of participants with lost expressions, or on the contrary full of anger or regret, emerged from the red cube by the hundreds, until they soon formed a group of about 10,000 people. The Oracle drones evacuated these participants in an orderly fashion, and the first wave of losers continued to stream out until about 25,000 participants with ragged faces had departed the venue. After a short moment of silence and inaction, the second wave emerged in turn, consisting of only a few thousand individuals. Lastly, a few hundred players strode with dignity out of the red cube, their poise and composure reflecting to all how exceptional they were. These players emitted an incredible aura of dangerousness, and most of them gave the impression of coming out of a battlefield. Jake wasn't confident that he could defeat any of them in a fair fight. These are the participants of a fourth ordeal, his grandfather commented coldly. Jake raised an intrigued eyebrow. Where did his grandfather draw that certainty from? Luckily, Lily, his youngest cousin, asked the question for him, satisfying his curiosity and sparing his saliva. I spotted a few familiar faces. The old man chuckled in an evasive tone. A few of his cousins and his uncle Elijah nodded as if that explanation was perfectly reasonable, but Jake would have liked to know why the old man hadn't hurried to greet them if he knew them so well. Naturally, he had no intention of asking his grandfather for the answer. Now that all the participants of the previous ordeal had left the premises, the players, patiently waiting for their turn, began to advance towards the red cube without rushing. Since violence was prohibited in the Oracle cities, there was no tension between participants. One by one, the players present entered the red cube and disappeared without so much as a sound. When it was their turn, their grandfather reminded them one last time to be extremely vigilant and persevere no matter what was ahead of them. Lily threw herself into her father's arms, tears in her eyes, and Tim's hitherto relaxed expression broke down, his lower lip and eyebrows trembling with grief. He had just remembered the death of his mother who had died shortly before his first ordeal. Rubbing his eyes to hide his tears, he ran into the red cube without saying farewell to anyone. There wasn't much Jake or the rest of the group could do to console the teenager, and it was already too late. Jake simply waved "see you soon" to his comrades and walked to the red cube too, ignoring his grandfather and his cousins. After a few days in his family's mansion, he had partially digested the resentment and negative emotions he felt towards them, but the time was just too short. Regardless of his grandfather's goodwill or his cousin's attempts to communicate, he was simply not at ease or comfortable in their presence. He always felt like a tiger in the middle of a pack of hyenas, even though he was aware that it was mostly in his head. As he crossed the red cube, he found that dark, lightless space where he could no longer feel his own body. A timeless space where it was easy to forget his own existence and where he had no need to breathe. Jake chatted with She to pass the time, until finally the long-awaited notification of the Oracle system pops up in his mind. Impatient, but with a slight stage fright, he discovered the setting of his second ordeal with a certain amount of bafflement. This ordeal was nothing like his first one. Participant, Jake Wilderth, Mertharian. Successful ordeals, 1. Awaiting matchmaking for second ordeal. Species allowed, humanoids. Matchmaking complete, second ordeal determined. Type, simulation/battle royale. Ether density, 4 or 40 points. Number of participants, 11,658,435. Background. The giant asteroid Eleanor VXII is an abandoned former System A0 outpost. The purpose of this outpost was to prepare the Zorian warriors to face the threats of the mirror universe. The place has long since been ravaged and has become uninhabitable after millennia of war, but a few Zorian survivors have made it their home and continue to carry on their traditions away from the eyes of the Oracle. Enter one of the sanctuary bubbles with your own identity, where these survivors thrive away from the rest of the world and endure the hardships the sanctuary bubble will put you through. An Oracle Guardian will lead you there. Each trial will make you stronger, and unique rewards await the ultimate winners. Main mission, enter Sanctum Bubble. Penalty for failure, none. Benefits and specifics during mission time. Spacesuit to withstand the vacuum of space and breathe. May fate work in your favor. No sooner had Jake finished reading the introductory report than he felt his consciousness being swept away by a mysterious, unstoppable force. When he regained the sensation of his body and the ground under his feet, he reopened his eyes. He was now on a huge asteroid, lost in the sidereal void. Chapter 227, The Asteroid Eleanor VXI. As far as the eye could see, a rocky, porous, grayish soil veined with patches that looked like some mysterious dark metal as black as oil. A distant star gave them its faint white light, which was no more intense than that of a full moon. The asteroid itself was rotating rapidly. The demarcation of the unlit side of the asteroid was rapidly approaching, while the sun was escaping in the opposite direction. With the exception of this tiny or distant sun, the sky was starless, giving an icy and desolate atmosphere where life should not have been able to develop. Once the surprise was over, Jake quickly acclimatized to his new sensations, vigilantly scanning the other astronauts around him. He was far from alone. Thousands of people of human morphology were standing beside him, wearing the same silver spacesuits to ensure good visibility of their wearer. The visor was not opaque, and he recognized the intrigued faces of his family members as well as those of his own group. Lily and Tim were easily recognizable by their size. In apnea since his arrival, Jake scanned his suit and the atmosphere of the asteroid as a precaution with his bracelet. As he expected, there was no breathable atmosphere on this asteroid. In fact, there was nothing to breathe at all, since there was nothing but a few cosmic particles and a magnetic field probably generated by the asteroid itself. Checking the scan report of his spacesuit afterwards, he was relieved to discover that it produced air that was perfectly breathable for Earthlings, and that there was enough oxygen to last for several months, even while being extremely active. Several blue cylinders reminiscent of the blue cube from the Oracle store were inserted into his breastplate and were releasing oxygen steadily while maintaining constant levels inside the suit. To contain that much oxygen, the space inside had to be considerable and certainly profited from the Oracle's space technology. Yet there was something strange about the atmosphere of this asteroid. The ether density was fluctuating oddly, sometimes at 40 as the introduction of the ordeal promised, sometimes so high that he was breaking out in a cold sweat. Searching for the cause of this phenomenon, Jake finally noticed a four-armed humanoid figure more than 4 meters tall, which he had unconsciously ignored until then. It was almost invisible, its obsidian-colored suit blending into the dark sky as it floated a few meters above them. Most of the participants present were totally unaware of the creature's presence. As time went by, and they saw neither the Oracle Guardian nor structures resembling the sanctuary bubbles they were supposed to reach, more and more players began to peer into the desolate world around them in search of a clue. Those like Jake, who had spotted the one who was to be their guide, remained silent and pretended they hadn't noticed anything. Who knew if this supposed Oracle Guardian was hostile to them? As more and more people became aware of the presence of a giant alien above them, the commotion began to dry up and the participants looked up at the mysterious presence that gazed upon them with indifference. Following the gaze of their comrades, the slower ones finally looked up in the right direction as well, but even then they couldn't make out anything in the middle of the dark sky. As if the alien knew that no more players would spontaneously notice his existence, a deep voice, shaking their suits and bones, resounded in Oraclean, reaching even the most distant ones thunderously. Under an almost irrepressible injunction, all eyes this time pointed in the right direction, where the humanoid creature was hidden. Disabling the camouflage function of its armor, a silver combat suit comparable to theirs, but heavily weaponized and reinforced, was revealed to them. Thousands of incomprehensible runes adorned each piece of armor with a modest bluish glow. Only the visor remained completely opaque, preventing them from distinguishing the face of the alien underneath. To many, these runes were a mystery, but Jake was familiar with these symbols. They were etheric runes, and although he didn't recognize all of them, he knew most of them after he had finished reading his manual on ether manipulation. Welcome to the asteroid Eleanor VXII. The Oracle Guardian greeted them warmly. I'm the Oracle Guardian Nemaler, but you can call me Nema. I will be your guide to the nearest sanctuary bubble and will answer any of your questions. Any questions? Despite the apparent warmth and friendliness in the alien's tone, his last question seemed more rhetorical than anything else. The Oracle Guardian clearly didn't want to be disturbed and regarded the reception of these newbies as a chore. Given the tone of the Guardian, no one dared to ask anything, even though they all had a lot of questions on their minds. In this case, let's get going. The giant alien yawned in a dull tone. Don't move more than 50 meters away from me. Before they had time to wonder why, the Oracle Guardian had already ditched them and was floating a few kilometers an hour in a certain direction. Jake took the recommendation at face value and calmly began to walk in pursuit of the alien with his group on his heels. What difference does it make if we get more than 50 meters away? A not-so-smart player whispered to the comrade next to him. Shut up and walk. I don't want to find out. A woman's voice replied curtly behind him. Wergerk. A few minutes later, the participants got the answer to this mystery. An alien who was clearly intellectually limited was lost in thought and had retained nothing of the Guardian's warning. Captivated by the sidereal void around him, he had naturally found himself lagging behind. No sooner had the alien moved more than 50 meters away than a terrifying pressure crushed him from all sides, crushing his armor and vaporizing his flesh and bones. The suit itself began to melt and then disintegrate, forming a new metallic patch on the asteroid's surface. Breathlessly, the players who witnessed the scene sprinted to position themselves directly beneath the Oracle Guardian, jostling anyone who hadn't been able to witness the scene. Jake hadn't missed anything of what had happened, but he couldn't figure out why. If it was gravity, the armor wouldn't have melted and they themselves would be in a terrible state. If it was the temperature, it didn't make sense either. As for pressure, there was no atmosphere that could generate such an effect. Determined to identify the reason, he moved to the edge of the Oracle Guardian and scanned the asteroid beyond that invisible limit. The feedback from the bracelet told him that there was a force field less than a meter in front of him and that it was moving at the same pace as the Oracle Guardian. The report of the situation on the other side left him deeply shaken. Ether density, 186,457 or 186.457 mpts. Gravity, 53,457. Temperature, 36,387 degrees Celsius. What the hell? Jake was so shocked, he almost let the Oracle Guardian get away from him. Those values were totally insane. A torrent of ether rained over the void on the other side of that force field. After trying to create his ether core for days, Jake was well aware of the ether limits his body could withstand. An ether density of 10 or 20,000 points was already causing him a little pain. He couldn't imagine what would happen if he exposed himself to a density of several million, but he would probably end up in the same state as the poor idiot on the outside who had just dissolved. Deeply shaken, he too hastened to hide under the reassuring shadow of the Oracle Guardian. He shoved a lot of people in his way, but at least he knew why he was doing this. Without the alien floating above them, they would all be dead already. What happened? Will worried when he saw how upset he was. Under the worried and curious gaze of his companions, he whispered to them what he had just discovered. As they learned the terrible truth, each of them was horrified. The participants listening close to them moved decisively closer to the Guardian after that. George and Bryce refused to believe it, but after doing their own test, they had to face the facts. Their expression was much less optimistic after confirming Jake's words. After a while, the clustered participants suddenly realized that the pace of the Oracle Guardian had begun to pick up. No sanctuary bubble was still visible, and the asteroid had already completed 3 rotations on itself, with day and night following one another several times in less than half an hour. Amusing and intriguing at first, the phenomenon was beginning to make them dizzy. The pace changed from a leisurely pace to brisk walking over the next hour, and then to a slow jog. Soon the group of players were running at a breakneck pace to the ever-accelerating Oracle Guardian, which floated above them with an indifferent expression, as if it could levitate like this until the end of time. Chapter 228, The System A0. Without knowing exactly since when, the group was running so fast that those with the weakest endurance were beginning to pant loudly. Those whose the ether stats were below 40 before the ordeal automatically had their stats raised to the ordeal's ether density, which was the best gift the Oracle could give them in terms of fairness. If they still couldn't keep up, this ordeal just wasn't for them. The first ordeal had the decency to give different tasks to different people, because each person's starting point was different. However, even the non-physical ordeals required a minimum amount of physical activity, ensuring that each player was at least able to run decently at the end of it. Just as children were entitled to a first special extended ordeal to accelerate their growth and maturity, obese, elderly, or physically impaired people followed their own course, and the special rewards offered ensured that their physique met the standards required for the second ordeal. If a participant was still unable to keep up with the running pace of the Oracle Guardian, there were only 2 possible explanations. Either the player had lost his physical condition after his first ordeal due to sedentary lifestyle, malnutrition, or an unhealthy lifestyle, or his will to persevere was simply insufficient. Since there were no elderly or overweight people among them, the breathless people at the back of the pack had no excuse and could only clench their teeth and try to push their limits. Jake, his group and his cousins had no trouble following the Oracle Guardian, but the spinning of the asteroid and the crowd of people around them made the experience all the more unpleasant. Minutes and then hours went by without anyone uttering a word. Only the heavy step of their gait and their controlled or jerky breathing were buzzing in the ears of the participants. Will couldn't stand the hush, so he decided to talk about astronomy, since it had been one of his interests when he still lived on Earth. Any idea why there are no stars in the sky except for this tiny white sun? Will raised his riddle, seeking their interest, but it was obvious from his tone that he had a pretty good idea of the answer. No clue, Tim said as he approached the businessman to better hear the explanation. Neither do I. Kyle grumbled as he tried to recall any scientific articles he'd read in the past. Sarah and the two sisters were silent, but they were also waiting for the answer. It wouldn't have made much difference to the two princesses, though, since their knowledge of the cosmos in their home world was limited to that of the Middle Ages. That they were aware that their planet EGA was not flat was already commendable. It's a white dwarf. The deep voice of the Oracle Guardian overshadowed Will's own voice as he was about to answer them, to his greatest frustration. So much for teasing them for so long. The systems are numbered according to their seniority in the mirror universe using numbers and letters. A through Z and 0 through 999. For those of you who have forgotten, your planet B842 is part of the system ZZ831. It's a very young system. System A0 is the oldest place in the mirror universe. Once the stars run out of fuel, they explode into supernovae or slash and collapse on themselves depending on their mass. If they are too light to form a black hole or neutron star, they form a red dwarf which, when they cool down, becomes a brown dwarf or white dwarf. If enough time passes, after 10 million quintillion of quintillion years, these white dwarfs cool down completely and stop emitting light. They become black dwarfs. That's why there are no stars in the sky except for this tiny white dwarf. This universe is so old that it's just full of black holes and black dwarfs. It's called the black hole era in cosmology. Any life form that can thrive swimming among these black holes is not something you can fathom at your present level. Oh, that was the word on the tip of their gaping lips. This Oracle Guardian was actually quite talkative once you got him started on a subject he was passionate about. And it was extremely fascinating, to be honest. Will was drinking the alien's words like a fanatical believer listening to a priest's mass. Jake listened calmly, but he couldn't help but curse the oracle who had sent them to this star graveyard. Were it not for the certainty that they could not die during their second ordeal, he would have viewed this ordeal as a suicide mission. After this short astronomy lesson, the Oracle Guardian once again withdrew into its silence, and this time the darkness around them gave them a very different impression, a feeling of extreme insignificance. The hours continued to fly by, without any sanctuary bubbles unveiling before them, the landscape remaining virtually invariant throughout their forced journey. After an indeterminate amount of time, another issue they hadn't foreseen arose. They began to feel hungry and thirsty, and for some, a pressing urge to urinate took over their thoughts. They had neither water nor food, and these would have been useless in space anyway. The equipment that Jake had so meticulously prepared before the ordeal was no longer with him. To wonder why their grandfather was so keen to have them gear up before it. The rapid rotation of the asteroid on itself, the day-slash-night cycles following one another, the oppressive darkness of the cosmos and the monotony of the scenery gradually eroded their sanity, and what was bound to happen eventually happened. One man, dripping with sweat in his spacesuit, began to have an anxiety attack. He was already claustrophobic to begin with, and it was a miracle that he had lasted so long. Completely out of his mind with panic, he started to tug on his helmet with all his might, trying by all means to get rid of it, and he succeeded. He mentally deactivated the safety devices of the suit with the help of his bracelet, and he was finally able to smell the fresh vacuum of the cosmos. With the asteroid now in its night cycle, many of the players who witnessed the scene expected to see his eyes or head explode, or at the very least see his body freeze instantly. After all, the Oracle Guardian's force field ensured that the ground beneath their feet remained cold enough for their armor to withstand it. This was not what happened. Movies had instilled many misconceptions, and death in space was one of them. Since there was no atmosphere, it was impossible to lose heat by thermal convection. It could only be lost by radiation, and it was a very slow process. In other words, this claustrophobic player didn't freeze, and for a few seconds he was able to observe the sidereal vacuum without interference. Then the pressure difference due to the vacuum took effect. Because he was gasping, with his mouth wide open, his lungs emptied in a fraction of a second. Because of the pressure difference, his body fluids began to boil, and his body swelled to twice its original size. As for his eyes, they exploded. Because the skin was elastic, the poor man was still alive. Because of his decent constitution, it took more than a minute before the panicking player lost consciousness, and although he regretted his gesture, the pain, panic, and his punctured eyes prevented him from putting his helmet back on in time. In his panic, the participant pushed away all those who tried to help him, and the players had to resign themselves to letting him die in excruciating agony. The Oracle Guardian, who could have easily saved him, remained unmoved by the scene. By halting momentarily to prevent this participant from being left behind, he felt he had already given him the chance he deserved. In the end, he was just one loser among many. This second horrible death, however, had a wonderfully revitalizing effect on the other survivors. After such a sight, those who felt vaguely cramped inside their suits found that finally they could bear with it for a while longer without any problems. Those who needed to urinate pissed into their spacesuit without hesitation, and it turned out that the suit was designed to handle this type of biological urge. A tank attached to their thigh was responsible for storing and recycling urine and sweat. However, there was no indication that the suit could handle solid biological waste, and fortunately, they did not have to find out the answer. After this incident, the participants kept running relentlessly without showing any sign of weakness, until finally a dome-shaped object emerged in front of them. As they kept closing in, they ran another 20 kilometers or so until the sanctuary bubble, which was half buried, fully encompassed their field of vision. In front of the enormous structure, millions of players made up of groupings like theirs were crowded together, patiently waiting for something. They had finally reached their destination. Chapter 2:29 Record. The sanctuary bubble was several tens of kilometers in diameter and had the appearance of an enormous drop of liquid mercury. Its surface texture undulated and distorted like the surface of an ocean under the influence of currents and winds. The Oracle Guardian that guided them finally slowed down until they were close to their starting pace. Like an airliner guided through an airport, he sailed among the millions of players until he found a vast open space that seemed to have been reserved for them from the start. Upon arriving at their destination, Jake expected to meet all sorts of more or less human aliens in the neighboring groupings, but he was startled to find that he was able to recognize some of the languages. Some of the participants were chatting in English, Chinese, or Spanish, all kinds of languages that he did not speak, but whose sounds he recognized. Of course, there were extraterrestrial languages, but not that many. The proportion of Earthlings was in the order of 5–10%. By analyzing the players they had just traveled with, he noted that there was indeed the same proportion of Earthlings. Because they spoke less, it just took him a while to realize it. Eavesdropping to spy on the conversation in the nearby crowd, he intercepted a conversation that gave him some answers about the current situation. "Are you filming?" A man with a strong Vietnamese accent asked another more wiry man next to him. These second ordeal recordings fetch high prices on the outside. "I've been filming all along." His comrade snorted with apparent disdain. "Well, keep going." The first man replied bluntly. Scanning the other men and women in spacesuits standing next to them, Jake noticed that they formed orderly rows and that their actions were extremely cautious and synergistic, as if they'd all known each other for a long time, or were at least accustomed to these risky missions. New Earth government lackeys. His cousin George, unsolicited, began to explain the situation to all of them. The Oracle device stores all our information and memories and can also record what we see with our eyes. With the Oracle device skill record, it is possible to transfer what we see and hear, but also to resell these recordings. There is a large market for this in the Evolver and Player Hall. Jake remembered that George had studied to be an analyst. Logically, there was a good chance that he worked for the government or had worked for the government in the past. No wonder he knew so much. What's the point of them filming this? Elijah, their youngest uncle, asked the question that everyone was wondering about. His kind tone made it difficult to put him off. Of course, these recordings may be valuable, but in today's context they provided very limited information. You have to know that everything, even we, has a price in the Oracle store. George whispered. For just under 5 years, we have diplomatic immunity that prevents aliens from other planets from treating us like commodities, but that doesn't mean that no information about us is marketable. This is especially true if the person seeking information about you has a higher Oracle rank. Accessing your ordeal results, identifying your rewards, your skills, or what you ate this morning is extremely simple for these people, as long as they have enough ether. The amount of ether required is usually a deterrent, and no one would go broke for new players like us. New Earth is no exception. That's where these cameramen come into play. With this bracelet feature, they can resell the footage from their ordeal or simply transfer it to their government for free. I guess that's how Grandpa got all this information and why he felt our results would be impossible to hide. Immersed in his reflections, Jake admitted that there was some truth to what his cousin had said. They had been running for hours on this asteroid, and there had been only 2 deaths in their group out of several thousand participants. This completely invalidated the results disclosed by his grandfather or those of Vincent and Anya. This could only mean one thing. The ordeal itself had not yet started. It would start when they entered this bubble, and those who were filming monitored each of the passages, as if their own ordeal was of no importance. The many Oracle Guardians were probably recording everything that was going on as well, transferring their report directly to the Oracle system. As if to confirm their suspicions, they noticed that from time to time a figure bolder than the others would venture alone to the sanctuary bubble and vanish inside in the same manner as when they entered a red cube. Likewise, other silhouettes were regularly expelled from the bubble. These were too far away for them to judge their expression, but judging by their disoriented movements and trembling, they had gone through a traumatic experience. In no hurry to make a spectacle of themselves, their group continued to observe the situation for the next hour. A few groups of latecomers led by an Oracle Guardian ended up occupying the few vacant areas that remained, and some of those who were already there entered the bubble in their turn. Watching the entrances and exits carefully, Jake finally noticed a pattern. Most of those who entered the bubble were actually ejected from it within 5 minutes. It took him some time to verify this phenomenon, because the incoming and outgoing participants were too far away, but confirmation was instantaneous as soon as members of their own gathering started to try their luck. A second interesting phenomenon was that those who came out of the bubble prematurely were temporarily left alone, but once these players regained their minds, an Oracle Guardian would come and throw them out of the protective force field. Whether by telekinesis or physically, these poor players would end up projected into the cosmos at the speed of a comet, their bodies disintegrating in a fraction of a second. Because there was no atmosphere, there was no noise or shockwave to shake the audience during these demonstrations of power, but the effect was no less terrifying. Clearly, the ordeal was over for these guys. On the whole, the majority of the players present were peaceful, but there were still moments of friction from time to time. Every time a fight broke out, an Oracle Guardian would exterminate the culprits the same way they eliminated the guys coming out of the sanctuary bubble. Soon, no one dared to create any more strife. Very rarely, some of the individuals who entered would not come out. They had successfully passed the critical phase of the second ordeal. Jake still became aware of a flaw in the strategy of these cameramen. Since they too were participants, they would have to enter sooner or later. They couldn't botch their ordeal, because after a failure, they were immediately expelled by the Oracle Guardian. Since they wore spacesuits that they could not take off and had no food to sustain them, this naturally meant that their time was counted. He didn't know how long these cameramen could survive on this asteroid, but his intuition was that the Oracle Guardians would not let these players stay passive for that long. Sooner or later, they would be forced to go in. When Jake became aware of this limit, some of the burden on his shoulders immediately disappeared. With the exception of the Oracle Guardians and those willing to pay the price, it would be impossible to determine exactly how long he had lasted from the moment he survived inside long enough. According to the ordeal's setting, it was a battle royale, but the fact that they were not forced to enter at the same time meant that the immediate threat inside was not the other players. Those who returned prematurely from the sanctuary bubble were often disoriented and terrified, or even outright traumatized. So there was something horrible waiting for them on the other side immediately after they entered. Jake continued to rack his brains for a few more minutes, his frown only getting worse as time went on. Then suddenly he burst out laughing. He was a Murtharian now. No matter the challenge in front of him, he would rise to it. Those who dithered in front of this bubble were only giving a head start to those who had entered before them. "I'm going in," Jake announced to his companions and cousins in a resolute tone. As if his group was waiting for some kind of signal, they all took a deep breath and started walking along with him. "We're all going together," Will said with a solemn expression. "Bring it on," Kyle shouted to give himself courage. His face suggested he was about to burst into tears. Sarah, the two sisters, and Tim nodded and walked behind them with no further ado, leaving Jake's uncle and cousins behind. Chapter 230 Open Water. Welcome to the Sanctuary Bubble. The first trial will begin shortly. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Simulation begins. After plunging into the bubble with a surface reminiscent of liquid mercury, he found an infinitely dark space where all his physical sensations disappeared in favor of an inexplicable quietude. He could have stayed there until the end of time without feeling the slightest boredom or frustration. Except that unlike the nothingness inside the red cube, which gave him plenty of time to regain his senses while giving him the opportunity to chat with she, this sanctuary bubble gave him no respite. Less than a second after entering this pitch-black space, a different notification from the Oracle system had popped up immediately in his mind. It was indeed different, since an artificial voice speaking in Oraclean resonated in his skull. Compared to the Oracle system's notifications, which were rather instinctive, the message was instantly delivered with no apparent reading effort. At the same time, before he could understand where he was and what was expected of him, he received another notification, this time from his Oracle system, informing him that he had completed the ordeal's main mission and that he was free to leave at any time. Main mission: enter the sanctuary bubble. Perfect rating. The hell? It was so ridiculous that Jake felt confused for a short while. During that brief moment when he was trying to adjust to the absurdity of the situation, the countdown from the artificial voice of the sanctuary bubble reached 0, and he felt his mind getting sucked into some kind of irrepressible spiritual vortex. In spite of the darkness, his spirit experienced an unpleasant sensation of compression, then distortion, followed by that of being centrifuged at a speed close to that of light. If he could still feel his body, he would probably have already vomited all his breakfast. As his mind was played with as if he had just been thrown into a washing machine running on full power, the dizziness and twirl that paralyzed his consciousness suddenly came to an end. Suddenly he regained the feeling of his body, first his arms, then his legs, and he felt the wind caressing his skin. When he opened his eyes, he saw a beautiful azure blue sky, devoid of any clouds, and the blinding rays of the sun struck his retina. Feeling like he was plummeting and feeling no ground against his feet, he looked beneath him and saw a mass of restless water drawing dangerously close to him. Before he could interpret anything, he hit the water mass heavily, lifting a geyser of foam. Splash! With his mouth open, he reacted too late, and a glass full of salt water flushed down his esophagus, ending up directly in his stomach. With his inertia, his body had sunk deep under the water, and he hurried to the surface so he could spit out all that water, otherwise he would choke. Some of the water had ended up in his windpipe, and his lungs were burning horribly. When his head came to the surface, he coughed with all his strength, spitting out some of the sea water that had been swallowed through his nose and mouth. He wheezed and gasped a few times to calm down and catch his breath. Fortunately, with his constitution and his present vitality, it took only a few seconds. With his composure restored, Jake was finally able to inspect the spot where he had just landed. The ocean was as far as the eye could see, except in one direction. The water was rather choppy, as if a storm had been blowing in the distance earlier, and waves several meters high were pounding his body in all directions, preventing him from having a clear idea of his surroundings. Still, he noticed that the water around him was littered with debris, whether it was dead algae, wooden planks, or other objects and components of all kinds that might have belonged to a boat. The boat had probably sunk to the bottom because of the storm, and Jake could see sinister rocky reefs nearby that supported his theory. This sanctuary bubble seemed to imply that he was one of the survivors of a shipwreck. Unfortunately, he didn't have much on him other than a pair of torn shorts and a tight black shirt in shreds. It seemed that this first trial was not intended to do him any favors. Every once in a while he would get bumped by a piece of debris, but he didn't worry about it. What worried him more was the difficulty he had in breathing and swimming, despite his stats. It was as if the ether was no longer the only component with a density of 40, but that gravity, atmospheric pressure, and temperatures had also increased fourfold. Even his mind seemed slower and more sluggish than it should be, as if the surrounding ether was putting pressure on him. Upon reflection, he realized that his body was being affected, but in proportion to his stats. In an environment where the ether density was 10, his ether stats of more or less 100 made him 10 times stronger than normal, but at a density of 40 the ratio dropped to 2.5. With his Murtharian body, he was still far superior to a normal human, but the change was abrupt enough to make him feel the difference. It was all the more noticeable for his mental faculties. He had already experienced this feeling of being mentally nerfed during his first ordeal, and he originally hoped to never experience this again. Focusing his mind, he tried to control his spirit body to resist this inexplicable pressure that was engulfing his spirit without consulting him. When he actively deployed his consciousness to resist this invisible oppression, he felt his mental faculties returning to him, but extending his spirit body in this way was no easy task. It was like doing the plank or the chair in a core strength session. Easy to hold for a few minutes, but excruciatingly painful beyond that. If he didn't have a spirit body thrice stronger compared to a normal human, this effort would have been extremely difficult to maintain. In full possession of his mental capacity, Jake finally turned his attention in the one direction where the ocean was out of his sight. A gigantic green island, perhaps as large as a continent, stretched as far as the eye could see in front of him. White sandy beaches, trees highly similar to palm or coconut trees, followed further on by an infinite lush jungle. Further still, mountain ranges covered the horizon, their snow-covered peaks disappearing into the few clouds. Some of these mountains were more than 10 kilometers high, a landscape absolutely impossible to contemplate on Earth. Not being senile, Jake understood that he was naturally expected to swim all the way to the island in question. After all, swimming stupidly out to the ocean when there was a beach nearby would be the epitome of stupidity and a waste of his brains. During this brief moment of pondering, which lasted only about 15 seconds altogether, debris from the supposed wreckage had continued to collide with him while he was not paying attention to it. But all of a sudden a sharp pain brought him back to reality. Not having forgotten that more than 90% of the participants failed in the first 5 minutes, Jake didn't relax for a single moment, and yet he didn't see anything coming. In a state of alertness, he scanned the murky water around him with vigilance. But the swirling waves and the depth of the sea floor made the contents of the water indistinguishable. Even with his present perception, he could barely make out the toes of his feet. However, from what little he could see, his blood had begun to mix with the sea water, and the bloody mark of a nasty bite about a few centimeters in size was apparent on his calf. With his flexibility, he could easily contort himself to observe any part of his body. This, he gasped. In turbulent, murky water covered with dead algae and debris, he had just been bitten by something, and the bite was quite deep. Even with the robustness of his body, he couldn't stop the creature's fangs. When he became aware of the situation, his blood froze, and a sudden panic broke out in him, which he quickly suppressed. However, he took action decisively to get out of this trap. Performing his best front crawl, Jake's athletic body began to split the surface of the ocean at the speed of a large sailboat with the wind behind it and headed towards the island. Despite the fact that he had just broken the Earth's swimming world record, his heart was beating faster and faster as he had a very bad premonition. Turning his head behind him out of an instinct for caution, he saw a fin, piercing the surface of the water a few dozen meters behind him, and about 150 centimeters high and 1 meter wide. The dorsal fin had a beautiful silvery blue color and seemed extremely smooth and hydrodynamic. This fin was advancing in his direction at a speed comparable to that of an underwater torpedo. Chapter 2, 31 5 minutes. When Jake saw this, his brain went into survival mode, and a shot of adrenaline and dopamine flooded his mind and body. As if he had just been injected with all sorts of stimulants, he accelerated sharply, his muscular arms stirring the water like two massive, tireless propellers. His skin radiated a beautiful orange light thanks to the lava-colored veins pulsating under his skin. His pupils also emitted an enchanting golden and silver glow, proving that his warrior Murtharian trance, spiritual Murtharian trance, and spiritual Murtharian eye skills were fully activated. Despite his best efforts, the marine predator was catching up to him at an alarming pace, and he might as well have just stood still and waited to be devoured. Regardless, with his persistence, Jake managed to escape the debris zone, and the ocean was much calmer once he was out of the reef area. This allowed him to pick up speed again, and although he was still several hundred meters from shore, he had already regained his courage and optimism. Giving everything he had, he swam as he had never swam before, surprising himself. With his intelligence and agility, he could easily correct his movements, and his few seconds of fleeing had already significantly improved the quality of his crawl. However, when he took another look behind him to check if the predator had given up, he almost swallowed water with a scream of fright. The fin was less than 5 meters behind him. And with the size of that fin and the location of the dorsal fin among the predatory fish of his knowledge, it meant that, holy shit, an enormous jaw spanning more than 3 meters opened wide suddenly behind him, multiple rows of teeth as long and sharp as cutlasses encompassing his field of vision. The open mouth of the ocean monster had a sucking effect, and the surrounding water was drawn towards the monster's empty mouth, dragging Jake with them. Already swimming with all his might, there was nothing Jake could do. The attack was so blistering and swift that he only had time to curse his bad luck and insult the oracle of all names before the shark's jaw closed with a resounding clang. The clang came from the monster's teeth fracturing against his body as he controlled his ether of constitution in the concerned area to resist the bite. He felt the beast release him, and an irrepressible joy filled his whole being. Then he started swimming crawl again, and suddenly realized that something was wrong. Why I am so slow? Jake wondered with some confusion. He was still swimming faster than a normal human, but his speed had been divided by 3. A brief moment later, he became aware of another fact. Why can't I feel my legs? As he made this realization, a searing pain hammered at his senses, radiating from his waist as if it had just been immersed in boiling water. Unable to continue swimming, he passed his hand to palpate his legs, but all he felt was the contact of sea water mixed with his warm blood. When he understood what had just happened, he felt a brief dizziness and his mind froze momentarily. By the time the ocean monster had closed its jaw, the shark had lost a few teeth, but it had not missed. Jake's legs had been torn off with a snap of its teeth and were now rotting in the predator's stomach. Feeling overwhelmed by a deep despair, Jake also felt his vision becoming blurred because of the blood loss. Because of the sea water, his gaping wound was constantly being washed away and the blood was not clotting. Without the muscles of his perineum and the bones of his pelvis, his bowels had nothing to hold them in, and his intestines were floating limply in the ocean behind him, forming a trail giving him the bleak appearance of a squid or jellyfish. When he thought his situation couldn't get any worse, he suddenly saw the same fin of what he thought was a giant shark come back, just as vigorous as before. Obviously, this thing had enjoyed his Murtharian's legs, and with the blood he was losing, his body was shining like a torch for all the marine predators in the area. He could already see a few fish that looked like prehistoric piranhas naughty pecking at his intestines as if they were a delicacy. Caw, caw. Looking up to the sky, he saw strange birds circling above him. Their beaks were extremely long and their hind legs rather short, but the reflection of the sun prevented him from distinguishing them clearly. Then, as if its undulating intestines on the surface of the ocean looked like big, juicy earthworms, one of the birds suddenly swooped down in a spin. What was left of its small intestine was swallowed in an instant, and he felt his body being dragged up into the air when the bird flew away with its trophy. Jake held on with both hands to his bloody intestine to prevent his stomach and esophagus from escaping his body as well, or he would die instantly. The pain he was now feeling was the most excruciating he had ever felt, and he had lost so much blood that he was no longer able to think. All he knew was that he heard a snap, and his body fell back into the ocean, lightened by much of his small intestine. Out of survival instinct and supported by his Murtharian fighting impulses, he mechanically swam back to the shore, but his speed had now been reduced to that of a snail. The current on the surface of the water was strong enough to prevent him from making further progress. He had no idea if the shark was still chasing him, but he continued to swim tirelessly. After a while, he felt algae caressing his skull and shoulders and realized that he should be close to shore. But fate, again playing a cruel joke on him, decided otherwise. Within seconds of wading through the seaweed, Jake found himself completely tangled up in it. If only that, he could have persevered indifferently. Unfortunately, multiple burning sensations pervaded the areas of his skin in contact with the algae, a sensation halfway between an electrocution and being lashed by a whip covered with thorns. A school of jellyfish. And not cute little jellyfish. These jellyfish were enormous mastodons whose heads were a good meter in diameter and whose almost invisible filaments stretched over tens of meters, transforming this area into a space of death. No wonder the sea monster didn't follow him. Already at the end of his rope, the nervous shock overcame his mangled body. The rest of his body found itself paralyzed before he could even react, and the half of his body that remained sank like a stone falling into a pond. While his consciousness was already fading, the burning of the water filling his lungs stimulated his life force one last time. Driven by a last ounce of vigor, his almost paralyzed body began to struggle, swimming upwards with difficulty thanks to the telekinetic outburst of his wavering consciousness. His golden eyes, wide open, could no longer discern anything but a tiny spark of white light, monopolizing and incensing his last fragments of will. His peripheral vision was already plunged into eternal darkness, and this shrinking patch of white light corresponded to the shining sun above him, which he was desperately trying to reach. For a vague moment, Jake thought he would succeed. He miraculously broke free from the translucent filaments lacerating him, and his arms propelled him a few meters up in a final battle for survival. Then he stopped moving entirely. The spark of white light anchoring his consciousness faded, and the telekinesis pushing the filaments back and moving his body faded too. His lungs were filled with water, but he wasn't dead yet. His constitution and vitality prevented him from dying so easily. Even with all that blood loss, giant jellyfish stings, his hypoxia, half his body, and much of his guts gone, Jake was still alive. But this time he didn't have the strength to hold on to life. As he sank to the depths of the ocean, he thought for a brief moment that dying like that wasn't so bad. He did not feel much. The water was at the right temperature, and silence accompanied him. Dying like that was almost relaxing. But deep inside, all he felt was deep regret. The regret of having failed to accomplish anything and the anger of ending up as fish excrement. The face of his cousin Anya, his uncle Kalen, and then everyone he had known quickly flashed before his eyes like subliminal images. The last image froze on the murky water, his sight returning miraculously in his last struggle. The enormous mouth covered with rows of teeth of a sea monster replaced this last image, and he felt sucked into the abyss. When the predator's jaw closed with a snap, Jake was already dead, his consciousness having long since ceased to exist. Chapter 232 Nightmare. Gasp. When Jake regained consciousness, he felt the caress of the wind and the brightness of the sun imprinting his retina behind his closed eyelids. He couldn't feel any ground under his feet. A dream? Shouldn't I be dead? Confused, it was his only coherent thought when he opened his eyes. Despite clear memories of his last minutes of life, he could barely tell the difference between dream and reality. However, his face stiffened and paled drastically when he recognized the place where he was. An azure blue sky without clouds, a bright yellow sun, the ocean as far as the eye could see except for a giant island less than a kilometer away. Splash! Just when he realized the horror of his situation, Jake crashed into the water like a meteor, lifting a geyser of foam as he landed. Perhaps because he had experienced this scene before, he reacted quickly this time, not forgetting to cover his nose and take a quick breath of oxygen before his big dive. Not having swallowed sea water this time, He swam cautiously to the surface without losing his wits. Once again in contact with the fresh air of the ocean, Jake still had to deal with the same choppy waters and the wreckage that was cluttering up the area. With the responsible reefs nearby and the murky water, this watery space was simply unnavigable. When the current caused a dead algae to stick to his leg, Jake shrieked in fright, swimming at full speed as if he had just returned to that nightmarish jellyfish school. When the trauma of his previous death had resurfaced, reawakening his fear that was just beginning to subside, he suddenly felt a kind of call inside him. This mental voice was insidious and terribly tempting, offering him the possibility of leaving this hell with a single thought. All he had to do was close his eyes in the hope that everything would stop, and he was absolutely certain that he would be able to leave this hell with a single thought. It was a feeling as malicious as that of a student trying to do his homework when he had his favorite smartphone or game console in his field of vision. Even if he was determined to do so, it was a distraction that was hard to ignore, and once it existed, it would trot in a corner of his head forever. A second insidious voice also kept reminding him that he had already completed his second ordeal. The main mission had been cleared with a perfect rating as soon as he had entered this sanctuary bubble. He was free to leave at any time. He had already accomplished his mission. Even the synthetic voice of the sanctuary bubble resounded in his mind, asking him for the umpteenth time if he wanted to carry on. While he was swimming his best crawl to escape the area of the shipwreck and the ocean currents, these thoughts were ruminating inside him tirelessly, eroding his will and courage. The trauma of his death was still extremely fresh, and a visceral fear prevented him from reasoning as he used to. But as Jake swam with renewed strength, other emotions arose within him, and he began to regain his normal state of mind. Yes, he could give up at any time, but in this case, wouldn't he be as mediocre and pitiful as those 99% who gave up at the first failure? If Jake hadn't endured all that testing and training during his first ordeal, he probably would have broken down instantly, and his mind would have had to be picked up scrap by scrap with a spoon. He would have come out disoriented and terrified like all those poor aliens expelled from the sanctuary bubble. Remembering the resentment and regret that had invaded him just before he sank into eternal oblivion, an unexpected rage bursting out of nowhere engulfed him, clashing directly with the sheer panic that prevented him from acting rationally. A moment later, when he escaped from the reef area, full of deadly sea currents, Jake found a calm and clean sea, and with that tranquil sea, he finally found his own quietude back. Squinting behind him because of the sun, Jake realized with some insight that the script for this scene had already changed from the previous one. He hadn't been bitten by a fish. The spilled blood hadn't attracted a shark, and he hadn't dithered in the area of the wreck, thus escaping the deadly zone unhindered. Momentarily, he felt such relief that he came close to laughing and sobbing at the same time. Yet his expression remained stern and focused. There was no way that this first trial could be over so easily. He was still too far from shore. As if to confirm his hypothesis, the giant fin of the predator that had devoured him a few minutes earlier suddenly surfaced above the water in the wreckage area he had just escaped. "Fuck me sideways," Jake cursed as he started swimming again under a new rush of adrenaline. He was a little ahead this time, but it wouldn't make any difference. Looking back on his first experience, he wasn't completely unprepared despite his emotional fragility. Persistent images of the monster's fangs or of his guts spilling into the ocean were still etched on his retina, and these hallucinations were transposed to reality, trying in vain to make him snap. If he lost himself in this nightmarish memory, he would risk losing it immediately, and his second ordeal would soon be over. Therefore, he tried to clench his teeth and mentally repeated the mantra, "I can do it," focusing on the challenge rather than what to expect if he failed. It was difficult with his current mental state, but with his Myrmidian bloodline his mind was much stronger and more resolute than before. He feared after his death that his stats would have decreased significantly, but surprisingly his ether of intelligence and extrasensory perception had improved slightly. Even his spirit body was showing signs of growth, although it was still minimal. Postponing these questions until later, Jake focused on the present situation. The sea monster was on top of him, and at this rate he would be devoured in less than 10 seconds. He absolutely had to find a way to get rid of the monster or find a way to gain speed, not to mention the damn school of jellyfish waiting for him a little further away. Who knew what other monstrous obstacle this event had in store for him? The first thing he did was to activate his telekinesis to amplify his movements. The skill was too low level to allow him to control the waves or propel his body quickly, but he could still use it to assist his movements. As he was about to execute his plan, he changed his mind. I can't fly fast, but as long as I float high enough, I have nothing to fear from that damn fish. Enlightened, he focused his willpower to pull himself out of the water, his body rapidly rising more than 10 meters above the water's surface. This action alone made him sweat profusely, and he remembered that because of the increased ether density, his mind was also under great spiritual pressure. He should be able to reach the shore by gritting his teeth, but there was a real risk of fainting before he reached land. If this happened, he would die instantly. No matter what, I have to give it a try. She, who was mute from the beginning, suddenly uttered a cry in his mind, bringing him back to the present moment. Watch out! Scanning the ocean's surface in panic, he immediately breathed a sigh of relief when he saw the giant shark wasn't on him yet. Unfortunately, she yelled again, and her tone was more pressing than the previous one. All of a sudden, a feeling of terror overtook him, and his body stiffened like a hare about to be captured by the talons of an eagle. Raising his head to the sky, he barely got enough time to see a giant shadow fall on him before he felt an agonizing pain pierce him through and through. The same giant bird that stole his intestines in the previous simulation had just inserted its huge claws into his chest, holding him firmly in their grasp. With his lungs and heart pierced, he only had time to discern the silhouette of the flying monster before his vision became blurred again. By the time he got used to the searing pain and overcame his loss of consciousness, it was already too late. He saw a cloud of giant, pterodactyl-like birds fused with hideous vultures swooping down on him to steal the prey from their fellow creatures, and an aerial battle ensued in which he was the main stake. In a fraction of a second, his body was shredded into multiple pieces, and his head fell back into the ocean, the shark's jaw wide open waiting below to receive him. Gasp! When Jake was resurrected once again, a long "fuck" pierced the silence as he was plummeting down into the ocean for the third time. Splash! The nightmare had just begun. Chapter 233 Loser. Gasp! On asteroid Eleanor VXII, a handsome young man trembling and shivering with terror was suddenly expelled from the sanctuary bubble like a fish leaping out of the sea. His pupils were dilated and the man was hyperventilating and wheezing non-stop, visibly in the midst of an anxiety attack. The spacesuit wasn't making things any better. His usual confidence and arrogance had shattered, and his slowly pulsating golden irises could not save his glamour. This thoroughly traumatized individual on the verge of despair was Kyle Gibson. No sooner had he set foot in this diabolical bubble that he had been thrown into hell to be tortured. Believing himself to be a good swimmer, he had hastily swam to shore with a shark on his tail, only to be surrounded by some kind of dolphins. Full of positive and candid prejudices about these marine mammals, he had been immediately relieved when the shark had given up the chase and even believed that these animals were coming to save him. Unfortunately, he couldn't have been more wrong. These dolphins were the most sadistic and perverse creatures he had ever had the misfortune to meet, and in addition to playing with him as if he were a moving piece of meat, one of the dolphins had even tried to him. In the end, they pecked him apart piece by piece, devouring him alive until he was nothing but a pool of blood and flesh in the middle of the ocean. These cetaceans were so fast that there was nothing he could do, and his terror was so great that he had been unable to maintain even the slightest coherent thinking. Therefore, when he had resurrected again, his subconscious had without hesitation seized the opportunity to get out of this hell when it presented itself. He hardly realized now that he had failed, but he did not care. What he had just experienced would give him nightmares until his death, and the idea that he could actually be eaten alive every time he faced the digesters challenged his very will to get out of the Oracle shelter to fight them again. His mind was completely broken, having given up all his ambitions of greatness. At that moment, a shadow passed over him, the silhouette of a four-armed giant floating peacefully in front of him. Another loser? The Oracle Guardians supervising their group bellowed mockingly. He couldn't count the number of similar vermin he'd already thrown out. Kyle ignored the alien, knowing full well what awaited him. He just wanted it all to stop. Maybe after a good night's rest, he'd see things more clearly. But right now, he just wasn't capable of anything. Seeing his panicked but strangely resigned expression, the Oracle Guardian suddenly felt like rubbing salt in the wound. Among the players who entered at the same time as you at your side, only you failed. It spoke gravely. The alien's face was hidden under his opaque visor, but he was undoubtedly disdainful. Even the child still persists. If you're not a loser, what else can you be? Hearing these last words, Kyle looked up at the alien for the first time, a deep shame rising from the depths of his mind to meet his panic. He was already regretting that he hadn't persisted for even a few more minutes, but it was too late now. I'm really a loser. That was his last thought, when the Oracle Guardian grabbed his shoulder and threw him at the speed of a cannonball into the vacuum of space. His body disintegrated in a flash, and he finally got the rest he deserved. After Kyle was ejected, the Oracle Guardian continued to float in the same position, staring at the sanctuary bubble where Kyle and his companions had entered before mumbling. Interesting. Meanwhile, Jake was unaware of his companion's situation and could hardly afford the luxury of thinking about it. He was fleeing the shipwreck area for the third time, and the damn giant shark, or at least something as dangerous, was chasing him tirelessly, reminding him how much he didn't want to be eaten a third time. The first two atrocious deaths had been enough. This time he didn't intend to try the airway again. It was just pure suicide, and he had learned his lesson. The sky was as deadly, if not more so, than the ocean he was in. The fleeting thought of giving up now was still running through his mind, and just the effort of concentration to retain his determination and keep moving forward demanded his full commitment. With his Myrmidian bloodline, he enjoyed challenges, but it had to be within his reach. For the time being, his initial feeling was that this challenge was impossible, and it was undermining his courage and persistence. The fact that there was no time out between the two revivals meant that he had no time to mull over what he had just gone through, and prevented him from flushing away the fear and despair burdening his mind. It was a vicious ordeal, bringing together all the elements needed to torture his mind and make him renounce. But Jake suffered from an ugly character flaw from a very young age. If he had his back to the wall, he didn't know how to retreat. That was the description of his fighting skill that the Oracle system had given months before. Out of pride, he was able to endure the worst horrors if he knew it was worth it. As long as he knew he could come back to life, he would never give up. And this ordeal was directly about whether or not he would become someone capable of making the law in the mirror universe in the distant future. He hadn't yet received any side mission through the coaching feature of his bracelet, and that meant that for the Oracle system, persevering was enough. It would be up to him alone to find the solution to his plight. Despite all his efforts and the fact that he was controlling the strength and agility ether more and more finely in his body to increase his speed, the shark had already caught up with him. The fin was only a few meters behind him, and he was already replaying the same scene from earlier in his head. At that moment he turned around, staring at the shark with his spiritual golden eyes, and the monster's jaw no longer felt so intimidating. Using his telekinesis to propel his body up into the air, the shark's jaw narrowly missed him with a loud clack. Watching the shark below him and the birds in the sky above, he slid a few meters hoping that the sea monster would let go, but it was all for nothing. The fin was chasing him with the resilience of a homing device, as if the creature knew it was impossible for him to stay up in the air indefinitely. As for the pterodactyl vultures, one of them had already begun to swoop down on him like a sacred arrow falling from the heavens. Motherfuckers, if that's how you want to play it, I'll give you your money's worth. You want to eat? Oh, you're gonna eat. Jake lashed out at them with all his rage, his fear entirely replaced by outrage. Inspecting the bird with his golden eye skill, the bird's movements slowed noticeably, its ethers flow, its nervous impulses, and every contraction of its muscles becoming clear under his gaze. Caw, caw, ca bwaff. Cawing arrogantly, its fellow birds, cheering from the skies, stopped squawking when Jake's skillful twist avoided the bird's dive, and then retaliated with a devastating right hook to its face. Although the gravity greatly diminished his strength and speed, he had put his heart into it. His right arm irradiated a red, orange, and yellow glow, and the impact triggered a lovely sound wave, followed by a crack. Knocked out on the spot, the bird dropped further towards the ocean and became the sea monster's new snack, successfully replacing Jake. Caw, caw. Receiving the bird's hateful cries, Jake gave them the finger, then plunged back into the water before the entire horde fell on him. There were several hundred of these giant birds flapping their wings a couple of 100 meters above him. If he just stood there, he wouldn't have lasted another 10 seconds. Getting a brief respite, Jake swam silently to shore, carefully scanning the waters for the slightest anomaly. The school of jellyfish that had intercepted him for the first time couldn't be far away. This time he had the chance to halt in extremis to admire the dam of jellyfish barring his way to the shore. There were jellyfish of all colors, and their semi-invisible filaments stretched for tens, even hundreds of meters, making the area completely impassable. Their size was on par with the megalodon that chased it, and some of these jellyfish were already drifting in its direction, propelling themselves in a succession of contractions and extensions of their slimy appendages. Within a blink he tried to turn back, but he was already surrounded. He then turned to the heavens, ready to use telekinesis once again. But at that very moment a stabbing pain pierced him from side to side, and he felt grasped again by long claws, his heart and lungs punctured. Watching the jellyfish shrink as he gained altitude, he just muttered a last fuck before dying for the third time. Chapter 234, I Can Try This Strategy. While Jake and the few dozen thousand remaining participants were repeating the same nightmare for the third or fourth time, a few players had already reached the shore. Somewhere on a white sandy beach, a wave bigger than the others came crashing down, almost reaching the edge of the palm trees lining the nearby jungle. As the wave receded, dragging sand, wood, and shells with it, an imposing silhouette with long claws and a carnivorous face walked out of the water with a heavy step. Behind it, a sea monster resembling a plesiosaurus was vigorously towed by this figure, the beheaded neck of the monster being firmly held by a steely grip. At that moment, an artificial voice resounded in the air, informing it of its success of the first stage. Congratulations XXXXXX for being the first participant to reach the shore in only 3 minutes and 6 seconds. 10,000 points for passing the first stage and 100,000 points for being the first. The second stage will begin shortly, in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. The silhouette revealed its fangs when it heard the ruckus in the jungle ahead of it. The second trial had just begun. Elsewhere, in another part of the island, two humans separated from each other by an indefinite number of kilometers received the congratulations of this same artificial voice with fury. Congratulations Bryce Wilderth for being the 77th contestant to reach the shore in just 11 minutes and 27 seconds. 10,000 points for passing the first event, and 10,000 points for placing in the top 100. Congratulations George Wilderth for being the 248th contestant to reach the shore in just 12 minutes and 14 seconds. 10,000 points for passing the first event and 8,000 points for placing in the top 300. For Bryce, whose ability to erase his presence was so strong that the unintelligent creatures would ignore him even if he stood in front of them, that first challenge was a big joke. In the eyes of these sea monsters and birds, he was no different from a seaweed or a stone, and he had swam peacefully to the beach, taking care to avoid the dangerous areas. Nevertheless, he had had plenty of time to admire the horrors of these waters and could not understand how so many participants could have a better time than he did. Who cares? What matters is to be the last one standing at the end. That was his consolation thought when the gong of the second stage sounded. For George, this event had also been extremely simple. His skin was covered with very fine cuticles capable of refracting or distorting light, as well as chromatophore cells infinitely more efficient than those of a chameleon. It could shine like a crystal to the point of being uncomfortable to look at or, on the contrary, become invisible by blending into the decor. As soon as he had entered the water, he had immediately activated his invisibility, and except for a jellyfish filament that he had inadvertently brushed against, the trip to the beach had gone smoothly. To be only 248th was a deep blow to his ego. Putting back the imaginary glasses he hadn't worn since his perception had reached a sufficient value, George also turned his attention to the jungle, ready to face anything that might come out of it. A few minutes later, in another section of the island, a human whom Jake would have been dumbfounded to see unharmed on the shore was listening attentively to the congratulatory message, as he too had the tenacious habit of putting glasses back on that he no longer wore. This dark-haired man, of average height and rather lanky physique, was none other than William Hopkins, one of Jake's companions. There was no fear on his face, not even the slightest indication of mental trauma. On the contrary, his face was relaxed and serene, even displaying a restrained, confident smile. "You may go," Will said in a farewell gesture with his hand. Upon these words, the killer whale-sized cetacean behind him uttered a shrill hoot before disappearing into the ocean from which it came, satisfied to be free again. As for Jake, the nightmare was far from over. On his fourth resurrection, he tried a new approach. If the path of the air was unfeasible and the path of water pure suicide, he still had one last option left to him involving his Murtharian bloodline: moving underground. The problem was nevertheless a big one. He had no idea how deep these waters were, and visibility was practically non-existent beyond a few meters. After 10 meters, he would literally be in total darkness, and when he recalled the atrocities that this ocean held on the surface, he could not imagine what kind of abominations were swarming in those depths. Just thinking about it, he was in a cold sweat. And yet he had to take that risk. The first time he didn't know that he could resurrect, and the next 2 times he still had the slim hope that he would be able to make it out of there alive in a frantic sprint. But after 3 gruesome deaths, he was now ready to consider this solution. Taking a deep breath, he immersed his head underwater, beginning his treacherous journey towards the ocean floor. Less than a kilometer from shore, he hoped it would be no more than a few hundred meters, but he also knew that the ocean floor could be much deeper than that. If it was located on an ocean trench, or if the giant island was just the top of a gigantic mountain or a plateau, this 4th attempt would end in failure. Alas, Jake did not have a chance to test his theory. Less than 30 seconds into his dive, he hit a spongy object. A fraction of a second later, he was held captive by the creature's tentacles and was quickly constricted to death before being thrown into the monster's wide, open beak. Gasp! Splash! The 5th time he tried to dive again and was intercepted by a shoal of jellyfish in the depths, which paralyzed and poisoned him to death. The 6th time, Jake swam for over a minute without encountering anything before. At the speed at which he was swimming, he had already passed the 200-meter mark and the pressure was starting to build. Thanks to his stone skin skill, this was no problem for him at the moment, as it tightened like a drum in the same way that sperm whales did when they hunted at depth. But suddenly he heard a humming sound near his ear, and he felt his consciousness clouding. Stunned, he momentarily stopped swimming and foolishly exhaled all his air before inhaling again, as if he was back on the surface of the water. A moment later, he had drowned himself, and a shapeless creature resembling a transparent plastic bag wrapped around his body before commencing the digestion of his fresh meal. Gasp! Splash! The 7th time. He wasn't so confident about this solution, and he tried his luck again on the surface. This time he miraculously escaped the shark's attention by giving it a bird to eat with the same diversion as on his 3rd attempt. But while trying to go around the school of jellyfish, he fell into a school of piranhas that only made a mouthful of him. After about 10 more attempts, whether from the air, the water surface, or by diving, Jake began to despair badly. His determination hadn't wavered, but he genuinely doubted that a solution existed. His intuition told him that an impossible trial made no sense, but he couldn't deny the possibility that it was the very purpose of this ordeal to test their resilience in such a way when there was no apparent prospect of hope. However, as he curiously inspected his status for the first time since his first resurrection, he got a surprise. His physical stats hadn't changed one iota, but his ether of intelligence, perception, and extrasensory perception had surpassed 115 points. His extrasensory perception, once at 127 points, had even reached 130 points. Even more surprisingly, his LVL 1.5 spirit body had apparently reached level 2 without him noticing. He hadn't felt any noticeable difference, but he knew what it meant. Spirit body LVL 2, stable, but immaterial, cannot affect the physical world and has no defense except the host's consciousness to resist external psychic influences. The performance of mental and etheric skills is slightly enhanced. Only the last sentence had changed, but it was an incredible source of optimism for Jake. It was only then that he realized that the mental pressure that was preventing him from thinking and using his skills properly was no longer that unpleasant. He thought maybe he was just getting used to it, but it was actually his mind that was getting stronger. I can try that strategy again. Excited, Jake deployed his spirit body as far as he could, and for the first time since entering the sanctuary bubble, he managed to expand his consciousness to over 6 meters, the etheric aura of the closest fish appearing in his mind like fireflies. For the first time since the beginning of this trial, he was no longer blind in these murky waters. Chapter 2:35 This trial. He had already passed it. With his spirit body deployed, Jake was now able to spot the closest life forms and adapt accordingly. It was far from perfect, but it was incomparable to the previous situation. He was no more afraid of sea creatures than he was of land creatures. What he really feared was the unknown and the feeling of powerlessness. With this new asset in hand, he could now gather information in advance and orient himself. Sadly, he didn't yet master any mental techniques. There must have been all sorts of skills using the spirit body or his ether to analyze his environment, but they were out of his reach. Jake had memorized all the ether runes in the manual, but most of them were useless without being connected to the others. Like the letters of the alphabet, more were needed to form words and then sentences. Some runes had powerful effects by their mere existence, but they were of no use in his present situation and would instead cost him a lot of energy and effort. Now that he could detect the creatures within a radius of 6 meters, he had regained his motivation and coolness, and it was with no hesitation that he dived back underwater towards the abyss. He already dared to take the risk when he could see nothing, so with the equivalent of a radar, he was completely relaxed. Now able to avoid the most obvious traps, he went around the schools of relatively static jellyfish on his way and hit the gills or eyes of the fish that came to tickle him a little too closely. When a shark, whale, or other giant marine reptile approached him too narrowly, he was now able to react. Tragically, the return to reality was abrupt. Narrowly avoiding a shark or squid that was a bit too curious was doable, once or twice, but when the whole ocean seemed to want its life, it was a different matter. A huge crocodile-like jaw suddenly appeared in front of him at a depth of more than 300 meters, the marine predator to which it belonged being so fast that he couldn't do anything. The ether mass had popped up in its field of detection, which was only 6 meters at the speed of a racing car, and had nonchalantly engulfed him in a gulp, burping a few bubbles before continuing on its way. Gasp. Splash. After that, Jake tried to reach the ocean floor countless times, being eaten, poisoned, or electrocuted so many times that he began to become seriously indifferent to the traumatic deaths. The most common deaths were when he was caught by a marine predator too fast and monstrous to react or defend himself. With his spirit body, he could more or less estimate from the shape of their ether what these underwater creatures looked like, and it was clear that the fauna in this ocean was nonsensical. There were, of course, fish, sharks, and cetaceans like dolphins and whales, but their evolution had twisted their appearance into something grotesque, each one of them being able to hold the headliner of a horror movie. The saying that a book couldn't be judged by its cover was totally wrong when it came to these creatures. Even the most insignificant fish were aggressive and carnivorous, not hesitating to charge or bite him, even when he whacked one of their fellow creatures to death with a single slap. The only way he had found to defend himself from these schools of carnivorous fish was to methodically repel them with his telekinesis, but this had the effect of mentally exhausting him. The deeper he swam, the greater the pressure on his body and the more his oxygen reserves dwindled. Having to concentrate in this way to fend off this small fry hastened his loss of oxygen, thus ruining his chances of reaching the bottom. Another solution he eventually found was to approach the lonely sea monsters in these waters on his own. Not all of these monsters were hungry. Some were even static in the water as if they were sleeping. If he did not provoke them, he could swim by them, which would cause these small carnivorous fish to let go. It was a game of trial and error, but slowly but surely he was making his way through. He had repeatedly wondered how these sharks, crocodiles, mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, and other monsters resembling nothing known could live quietly in the midst of all these piranhas capable of crushing his bones with a single bite. and he had quickly discovered the reason after a few forced skirmishes. All these sea monsters, except for small fish, jellyfish, squid, octopus, and other invertebrates, had skin covered with a thick protective layer as hard as rock. These fish were unable to overcome these defenses and would instead serve as a snack for these giant predators if they were too insistent. This did not mean, though, that octopus and squid were vulnerable prey. Jake had paid the price at his own expense. The skin of these invertebrates was so rubbery that even the sharpest teeth left only slight marks on their spongy bodies. Jake didn't know what these fish ate to survive, but it was clear that humans had a respectable place on their menu. At least half of his deaths were due to these schools of fish. The second most common type of death were, of course, these giant predators, such as megalodons or marine dinosaurs. The third most frequent type of death came from these bizarre marine creatures or invertebrates with mysterious capacities from which it was generally impossible to defend oneself. The plastic bag was one of these life forms, jellyfish and squid being other examples. Jake met them every time he managed to reach the great depths, where the sunlight had practically no more hold. Jellyfish and plastic bags were not too hard to avoid. Their mobility was limited, but he wasted time going around them, which led him to make mistakes that often led to his loss. Deeper down, however, when the squid and incomprehensible monsters became legion beyond 1,000 meters, Jake truly began to lose hope. There were no signs that he was close to the bottom, and his unexpected appearance attracted the curiosity of the deep-sea fish. Luminescent eels, translucent fish with sharp, poisonous fangs, ogre fish, coelacanths, angler fish, electric moray eels, and a few titanic monsters swarmed at these depths, and each death he endured was more incomprehensible and nightmarish than the last. Untiringly, Jake pushed his limits, learning from these creatures with his outstanding intelligence to learn how to counteract and neutralize them. Sometimes he suffered a horrible death, but the next time he would advance a few meters and regain his resolve. Finally, after so many attempts that he had lost count, Jake's hand touched the ocean floor for the first time. The pressure was insane, and it was pitch black at that depth. Without his sturdy body and his stone skin skill, he would have been reduced to bone and flesh a long time ago. The abyss was silent and the water stagnant, almost warm. The place was morbid and confusing, and yet if Jake could burst out laughing, he would have. Unfortunately, his compressed lungs were burning from lack of oxygen, and he was dizzy. With time running out, Jake hurried to activate his earth manipulation skill, and when he did, the smirk on his face turned into a ugly rictus. Soon after, he exhausted his oxygen and drowned to death at a depth of over 1,000 meters. Gasp! Splash! The Jake who emerged on the surface of the water after yet another resurrection looked austere and glassy-eyed. Hope had completely disappeared from his eyes for good. Whatever he tried was doomed to fail. His ether of intelligence, perception, and extrasensory perception had reached 165 points, while his spirit body had reached level 4, but it was precisely for this reason that he knew it was a lost cause. He could once again extend his consciousness over 10 meters without any particular effort, and no migraine had assailed his skull for several hours. He was smarter than ever, and these troubled waters full of danger no longer intimidated him. Had he been in his own pool at home, he would probably have been just as relaxed. And yet, despite this dazzling progress, there was no joy left in him. By the time Jake had reached the bottom of the sea, he had discovered the sad truth. There was no ground to manipulate. No sand, no dust, no gravel, no rocks. Just a huge, totally indestructible block of alien metal covering the ocean floor as far as the eye could see. He had swum a few hundred more meters before he drowned to make sure he wasn't just unlucky and in the wrong place. But he had to face the facts. Maybe this block of metal had a limit, but he didn't feel like checking it anymore. Because of his depression and mental exhaustion, he didn't realize that he had let himself be influenced by his Murtharian mindset. Faced with the challenge of touching the bottom of the ocean, he had devoted all his efforts to it, and upon discovering that it was all in vain, he was now feeling a little empty. But the reality he was not yet aware of was that the depth separating the surface of the ocean floor was actually greater than the distance between his current position and the shoreline. This trial, he had already passed it, multiple times. Chapter 236: Man vs. Shark. As Jake silently lay depressed on the surface of the water, floating like a drifting board, he felt one of those fucking piranhas approaching to bite his leg. Indifferent, he let the fish bite him, and then leave with a piece of flesh as a trophy, before his gaze lingered on the blood escaping from his wound. As was to be expected, the fin of the megalodon roaming in the area of the wreck soon reappeared. Seeing this familiar fin close the distance, Jake's depressed expression was suddenly replaced by a frown, followed by the convulsive twitching of his facial muscles. In an instant, his depression had given way to an expression of unadulterated wrath. The change was so rapid that it was almost inconceivable. "All right, I'm sick of this shit. I've been racking my brains running away from these monsters looking for solutions and shortcuts. And for what? Fuck. I'm sick of your fishy faces. You want to eat me? Let's see who eats the other one first." He was so emotionally on edge that his Murtharian impulses had a stronger hold on him, his sanity relying on the pleasure these endless challenges could bring him. While joining the island was just another challenge whose possibilities he hadn't yet tested, it had no appeal for him. He was just tired of running away, and pummeling this shark to death seemed right now to be the best outlet available to him. She, who had remained virtually silent throughout the ordeal to the point of almost making him forget her existence, smiled inwardly. She didn't have a real body, but her satisfaction was heartfelt. She could have influenced him, or even cheered him up, but that would have worked against the ordeal's intentions. To really benefit from it, he had to achieve this alone. The young Zorian warriors enter these bubbles to become stronger, she explained suddenly, almost startling Jake out of surprise. If they could reach the shore with luck or by exploiting a loophole, this trial would no longer serve any purpose. For it to make sense, you need to struggle. When Jake heard those words, he felt enlightened. There was no doubt that certain individuals possessed abilities suited to this environment. Whether it was the ability to camouflage themselves, to fly or swim fast, or even to intimidate or tame these animals, there were all sorts of ways to deal with it. His bloodline, unfortunately, possessed none of these traits. To put things in perspective, if the first challenge had been to survive as long as possible on a volcanic planet irradiated by a nearby star and a thin atmosphere, he would have been like a fish in water. His Murtharian bloodline was still only level 1, but it gave him incredible resilience to temperature and radiation. He could even feed on it to strengthen himself. With an equivalent constitution and vitality, it could probably withstand temperatures and radiation many times higher than a normal human. During this short exchange with his Oracle AI, the Megalodon had fully bridged the distance between them. With no time left to monologue, Jake's expression became as cold as a reptile's, while his body's muscles tightened in preparation for the confrontation. With his arms spread out in front of him and his body slightly sideways, Jake had faced these sea monsters indirectly so many times that he knew exactly how to react. He didn't have a machete or knife to deal the fatal blow, but that didn't mean these creatures had no weakness. As the giant shark opened its mouth wide to swallow it in a single bite, Jake skillfully spun away, using just enough of his blue and purple ether to control the monster's nerves. Briefly under his control, the shark veered off course at the last moment, exposing its gills, and Jake packed all of his red, orange, and yellow ether into his arm, fingers outstretched to strike this weak spot. His sheathed hand went into those gills like a knife into soft butter. To resist the piranhas, all the predators had extremely resistant rocky skin, their only weak points being their eyes and gills. To protect these weak points, the eyelids of these animals were also rocky, and their gills could close completely between each inhalation and exhalation. In order for Jake to injure the monster, he had struck with all his might, his fingers almost breaking on impact. But Murtharian claws were no joke. Rower. The giant shark, mad with pain, began to wiggle around, his body and tail twisting repeatedly in all directions like a whale that had just been harpooned. Jake had no intention of letting go, and now that he had a grip, he began to throw a series of punches, each more violent than the last, at the monster's body. Never having had the opportunity to punch anyone so freely except low-level digesters, he was not used to hitting as hard as he could. Opening the pores of his skin, he began to absorb the sun's rays, and all his Murtharian skills were activated to boost his physical strength. His body began to warm up, a stream of warm water forming around him. He then added telekinesis to accelerate his arm and create an invisible force field around his hand. He also focused to transfer all the excess heat in his body to the fist, and the fist started to glow like a burning firebrand. Each punch was like a heavy hammer shattering and burning the monster's natural protective plates, and in just a few strokes the plates began to crack. After a few dozen more blows, the muscle underneath was exposed and cooked rare. However, because of the immense size of the monster, these injuries were insufficient to bring it down. Realizing that a simple punch would never overcome the shark, at least not in a short time, he changed his approach. The more Jake fought, the more he became accustomed to his new bloodline abilities, and every second he discovered new uses for them. As he was about to deliver yet another fiery punch, he stopped when his gaze fell on the retracted claws of his raised fist. It was logical after all. Without this basic skill, he would have injured himself. His fingers were rather thick, and his translucent claws with red veins could be stored in a dedicated space above his phalanges, directly under the skin. Surprisingly, this didn't stop him from bending his fingers, and it was not the time to worry about it. The key point was that he understood that if these claws could be retracted inside his body, then he could probably expand them further. The only question was to what extent. He hadn't tested their durability either, but unlike the painful joints of his fingers, his claws were in perfect condition after this barrage of ultra-violent blows. Translucent as crystal, with fine capillaries of lava circulating inside. He had finally figured out how to use his claws. With a thought, he redirected the heat contained in his fist to his claws, and the claws in turn began to emit an intense yellow-orange light. The heat radiating from his claws caused the water nearby to boil. With a second thought, he made his claws grow until they reached their maximum size of about 10 centimeters. Eager to test this new combo, he stuck his hand into the monster's rocky skin, and unlike the previous situation, the claws sank into his body like a hot knife into a lump of wax. Roar! This time really provoked, the shark started to flee to the depths, hoping that the human would give up chasing it. Clearly, the creature was not completely devoid of intelligence. Meanwhile, Jake, in a frenzy of excitement, began to lacerate the sea monster with scratches and pokes, each scratch ripping off an astronomical amount of flesh. With each blow, the initial wound grew deeper, and one of the monster's two gills was now completely cauterized. For the first time, the monster began to asphyxiate, and Jake used the opportunity to crawl his way to the other side of the monster with his claws and perform the same feat on the other gill. The battle between the man and the megalodon lasted a few more minutes, stirring up multiple waves and an astronomical amount of foam that drove away most of the predators nearby. Then it was silence again. Jake removed his glowing claws from the monster's brain and smiled as the giant carcass disappeared into the abyss. His revenge had just begun. The fight had worn him out, and the migraine was back. Heating his body in this way made him feel feverish now that his body was cooling down. Using these ether skills came at a price. His mental and psychic faculties had outgrown his body, and an imbalance was slowly emerging. Nevertheless, it was nothing that his body could not recover from in a few minutes. The other fish had fled during their fight, but now that the shark was dead, all those predators would soon return. So Jake swam calmly out of the wreckage area, without overexerting himself, to give himself time to recover. A moment later, he had regained all his strength and resumed swimming towards the shore. Whereas before he would have hastened, now he was taking his time. Only his head was sticking out of the water, but whereas before he seemed to be a helpless prey, he now had the aura of a crocodile in ambush. From now on, he was the predator. Chapter 237: The Two Sisters Bond. While Jake embarked on a long and vengeful hunt against any sea creatures or birds that had caused his death at least once, the ordeal kept proceeding for the rest of the participants. Those who had not been able to reach shore had long since given up, and those who were able to had long since begun the second or third trial of the sanctuary bubble. Those like Jake who were able to persist this long despite the many failures were extremely rare, but on the scale of 11 million players, there were still quite a few. Among them were two pink-haired young women in their 20s who had finally made it to the beach after countless efforts. Their bodies were absolutely gorgeous, and most of the men would have had a hard time controlling themselves in their presence. But right now they looked like they were at the end of their rope. Their faces were emaciated, their eyes hollow and absent, while their once perfect bodies were covered with numerous wounds and bites. Although the body was brought back to its original state with each new attempt, it was still emaciated and skeletal, as if they had spent not just a few minutes at sea, but several weeks. Knowing the personalities of the two sisters, Jake assumed that they would have given up long ago, but he had underestimated the bond between the siblings. The first event being individual, Inya and Essia had been forcibly separated by being sent to two different areas of the island, and it was the first time they had endured such a separation since birth. Even in their home world, they never left their castle and had never been more than a kilometer away from each other. This separation was therefore a trauma for which they were not prepared. In the absence of their parents, they could only rely on themselves, and the siblings were extremely dependent on each other. By being separated in this way, like Jake, they were devoured in atrocious conditions, adding greatly to their initial panic. And yet, where Kyle had immediately broken down, they had stood their ground. Even though they had grown up with a gold spoon in their mouth and were rather timid in the face of physical exertion and hardship, it was impossible for them to abandon their only sister. Even though Inya was terrified and wanted to give up more than anything, there was still the slim possibility that her little sister Essia would persist to the end and reach the shore. If that happened, not to mention the shame that would ensue when they were reunited, it would also mean that she had failed her as an older sister. Essia didn't have the same burden on her shoulders, but neither did she want to abandon her older sister on this island. Therefore, even though they had to shed all the tears of their bodies countless times in terror and despair, they held firm. Because they had exactly the same abilities, the only solution they had found to reach the shore was naturally the same. The two sisters were not good fighters, and their physical constitution was nothing special, not to mention the fact that they were women with a small body and a height of about 155 centimeters, which was also nothing special among women. Without considering the ether stats, their body stats were probably 4 to 5 times lower than Jake's in strength, agility, constitution, and vitality. This was a biological limit that was impossible to overcome without an incredible ether advantage or a high-grade bloodline. So their only resort was the only ether spell they had in their arsenal, Fireball LVL-0. A few days earlier, their fireball was really pathetic and laughable, no more than the size of a tennis ball, mediocre heat, and low attack range. A normal adult human could survive such an attack if the face wasn't hit with a few serious burns, not to mention all those sea monsters. Fortunately, the sanctuary bubble was fair. No megalodons, mosasaurus, or giant vulture pterodactyl eager to eat them. There were sharks, yes, dolphins, jellyfish, and birds of prey, but their size and looks were far less grotesque, as was their ferocity and relentlessness. Put in perspective, it was a challenge that was still extremely arduous, almost impossible for them to overcome, but compared to the one Jake was enduring, it was as simple as swimming in one's own bathtub. Unlike Jake, who was unable to concentrate during his first attempts, the ether spell they mastered did not require any special mental effort. It was an instinctive spell instilled by the oracle system in their etheric code, and all they had to do was wish to cast the spell by opening their hands for the fireball to be generated. Even in water, the fireball would still eventually form, boiling the water and producing a significant amount of steam. Alas, as soon as it was thrown at the enemy, the fireball would extinguish immediately as soon as contact with the power source powering it was cut off. The two sisters had therefore slowly progressed towards the shore with a fireball in their hands at all times, and this had initially been effective in discouraging the smaller and more wary fish and predators. However, there was no way that this first trial could be so simple. Some of the energy that powered their fireballs came from the bodies of the two young women. It was a safety measure put in place so that they could still defend themselves if they had to face a mage with perfect control of the ether around him. A greater spirit body could expand to form a spiritual realm around it with the effect of suppressing the etheric abilities of the inferior evolvers. In such critical circumstances, an alternative energy source was absolutely necessary, and it could only be their own body. Because their Fireball LVL-0 was of the lowest level, the possibilities in terms of control and modulation when creating the fireball were virtually non-existent. Jake had shown them that it was possible to influence the diameter, temperature, and throwing force of the spell with good ether control, but this did not solve this fundamental constraint. Not at their level. After having received their share of the sale of the rank 7 digester corpse, they had been able to maximize their ether intelligence, perception, and extrasensory perception, which had completely changed their destiny. They now had the potential to perform the same ether manipulation as Jake, but their training had not been long enough. To become so proficient with his ether control, Jake had tried for a long time to train his ether core without success, which was a great way to temper his mind and spirit body. With the assimilation of his Murtharian bloodline, his spirit body was even 3 times stronger than normal, and it was a level that they could not reach in a short time. In other words, because their intellect and mind was also nerfed on their first attempts, the 2 sisters had been devoured without being able to do anything about it. Every time their bodies reached their stamina threshold, the fireball would burn out, and all the predators lurking around them would come at them and swallow them whole. After about a dozen deaths, which had left them distraught with despair and victim of a potentially incurable post-traumatic stress disorder, the 2 sisters had begun to feel the first changes. Each revival, by bringing them back to the initial moment, would repair the psychological damage done to their minds, notably by gently soothing their minds. Emotions such as fear relied heavily on certain hormones and neurotransmitters such as adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, and glutamate. Since the body was reset, so was the brain. Only their proto-soul or soul retained the memory and horror of the traumas they had endured. The psychological after-effects of a past trauma, such as PTSD or chronic depression, had multiple causes, but they often stemmed from the perception of the causal event. For example, one could become depressed after the death of a loved one to the point where one would not be able to enjoy life for years afterwards, but for this one had to feel sadness. If the event did not generate any tangible emotion in the brain, or at least that it was quickly neutralized, they would ultimately remain as a neutral memory. One might remember that it was a sad event, that one didn't want to relive it, even draw lessons from it, but the chemistry of our brain and future personality would no longer be adversely affected by it. This meant that this first trial was not as terrible and sadistic as the first deaths had led them to believe. After the shock of the first deaths, anyone could experience the changes in their psyche. The deaths were still as painful and frightening as ever, but the more time passed, the less they impacted them. The most primal phobias, such as the fear of water, of being eaten, of darkness, or of drowning, were purged one by one, until a clear and serene mental state was left, difficult to influence. An ounce of energy would also nourish their spirit, slightly increasing their ether of intelligence, perception, and extrasensory perception, and solidifying their spirit body. Although the 2 sisters did not possess the self-encoding of the Murtharian bloodline, nor the same aptitude to grow faster by surmounting challenges, the benefits of these resurrections were far from negligible. Thus, after many attempts, their ether control eventually improved enough for their fireball to become capable of blasting any sea predators in sight. Sharks? Blast. Jellyfish? Blast. Any creatures in sight? Blast. They blasted everything in their way. Enya and Essia thus managed to reach the shore in this slimmed-down physical state. Cast all those fireballs had used the fats, sugars, and proteins of their bodies as fuel, but they had held on. Their faces may have been emaciated and their glassy eyes the shadow of themselves, but they had triumphed. They were no longer the same carefree young women, and a new wild nature had awakened in them. They were now true players, and they were ready to play this game for real. Chapter 238, End of First Trial. Somewhere on the island, many hours earlier, a young teenager of about 11 years old was catching his breath on all fours on the white sand. Unlike Jake, Sarah, or the 2 sisters, the first event had been nothing special for him. But swimming such a distance had not been easy because he couldn't swim. That young boy was Tim. His danger sense skill gave him an almost unrivaled ability to sense danger and anticipate it. Even though his perception, intelligence, and extrasensory perception had been nerfed when he entered the sanctuary bubble, it didn't affect his ether skill too much. Like the Fireball LVL-0 of the 2 sisters, it was a passive, automatic, effortless skill. He had no idea how this foresight worked, and he didn't care. What mattered was that it worked. Tim had died many times in the beginning, But despite his young age, he had adapted easily. After all, swimming was supposed to be intuitive. Babies knew how to swim when they were born, just like most animals. His first ordeal was inspired by the Spartan Nagoj, a stringent way of training young warriors. After the initial training, they would be left to their own devices, and the last year of his first ordeal was spent surviving alone in the wilderness. The young boy was therefore extremely robust and mentally resilient despite his apparent physical immaturity. He had lost his mother and could no longer clearly remember his father's face. He had virtually no memory of the years before his arrival on B842. His first vivid memory in the mirror universe was of a man being devoured by digesters. His meeting with Jake, followed shortly afterwards by his mother's death. Since then, something was broken in him, and the joviality and candidness expected of a child his age was non-existent. The fear of being eaten alive by a pack of wolves, the fear of being beaten up for stealing an apple, the fear of being whipped for insubordination or insolence, hunger, thirst, lack of sleep, cold. Tim was familiar with all of these feelings. His ability to feel emotions had long since dulled, and his only concern at the time was simply surviving that day without thinking about tomorrow. That was how he had spent the 5-6 years of his first ordeal. This second ordeal was in essence no different. The agony was incomparable. He was terrified, but the consequences were not irreversible, and with his ether skill, it was easy for him to keep hope. Each of his deaths were accidental. Once he had been fooled in one way, he would simply adapt to escape the next time. All children like him had been trained in Beskar. Although the world was different from Jake's ordeal world and the rest of his group, Beskar was also a deserter of System A16, which the local people worshipped as their original god and ancestor. The Beskarians were endowed with a unique faculty called inner luck. The world seemed to bend to their whim in an inexplicable way, and this passive influence on the environment increased in scope and power with age if this inner luck was sufficiently stimulated and relied upon. Tim, like most children who had successfully completed their first ordeal, had therefore inherited this Beskarian bloodline and inner luck. This was the most primitive form of this bloodline, 80% impure, but it was enough for it to achieve grade 8. By unlocking this bloodline, he had obtained the Ether Luck stat and Lucky Body LVL1, as well as the Inner Luck skill that complemented his danger sense. The Lucky Body LVL1 gave him a chance 3 times higher than normal compared to randomness, while the Inner Luck skill allowed him to consciously influence the world according to his desires and needs. However, each time he used it, he would tap into his good luck capital and take the risk of being equally unlucky in the hours or days that followed. The Ether Luck stat was unfortunately extremely difficult to improve. It took a shimmering 1,000 ether points to encode a single point. In other words, even when receiving a share of the sale of the rank 7 digester corpse, his Ether Luck stat had not even reached 20 points. His luck was therefore about 6 times better than normal. Where it was easily observable in simple acts such as dice rolling or slot machines, where the luck was focused, the effect was almost insignificant in complex situations, since the range was limited by his spirit body and extrasensory perception. Regardless, it was a priceless bloodline in the mirror universe, and the last gift the Oracle system gave to young children to give them an opportunity to grow up. To do this, these children still had to pass their first ordeal, but combined with the ether skill that each child had, it was normally highly probable. This Beskarian bloodline was his biggest secret. Since it did not change his appearance, he had disclosed to the rest of the group that his danger sense skill had been upgraded after his first ordeal. It was in fact a half-truth. This skill had indeed become more effective, but it was because of the excellent synergy with his inner luck skill. So Tim had eventually reached the island by actively using his danger sense skill and exhausting much of his luck. Predators tended to ignore him or change direction, while his dodges and spontaneous retaliation were usually exemplary, always hitting a vulnerable spot on his enemies. The swim had not been easy, but he was confident that he had achieved one of the highest scores. He was eager to see how he fared against the other participants. Congratulations, Tim Parody, for being the 996th contestant to reach the shore in just 3 hours, 6 minutes, and 27 seconds. 10,000 points for passing the first event and 1,000 points for placing in the top 1,000. Having recovered his breath, Tim listened silently to the artificial voice and pouted when he heard his score. However, when he remembered that there were over 11 million participants at the start, a big smile curved onto his lips. It was an authentic childlike smile, something he no longer thought he was capable of. Upon reflection, his smile faded, and he regained a dull and jaded expression. It was time for him to focus on this second and subsequent trials. The ordeal was far from over. Long after the first trial had begun, long after Will, Tim, or the two sisters, a woman with long golden hair set foot on the beach like a goddess springing out of the sea. Her golden irises emitted a sinister glow, while her face disturbingly resembled the faces of those psychopaths who loved torturing kittens. At that very moment, although she was practically naked, Sarah had no sex appeal. Most of the men who kept ogling her would have run away upon seeing her, their testicles shriveling like two raisins at her sight. Significantly affected by her myrmidian drives, this ordeal had completely awakened her sadomasochistic tendencies. Where Jake was more reserved and maintained a rather stable personality if he was sufficiently calm and rested, Sarah's temper had changed irrevocably when she had assimilated her bloodline, but it was a change she fully embraced. Between the superficial, teasing, and manipulative woman of the past, she preferred by far the strong, proud, belligerent, and fearless woman she had become. She didn't want to be a nobody. It was something that had never changed, either before or now. On her first attempt, she found herself caught up in a fight to the death with a sea dinosaur instead of swimming to shore. It had taken several dozen resurrections before the mental nerve was sufficiently reduced to make her realize the absurdity of her actions. This did not stop her, though. Like Jake, that first trial had only awakened her thirst for combat and challenge, and that trial in the ocean had quickly turned into a playground where she could let off steam and fully familiarize herself with her new abilities. When she heard the artificial voice announcing her score, Sarah snickered derisively, as if she had been expecting this pitiful result all along. Yet when she heard the series of notifications that followed, she was dumbfounded for a long time. Who would have thought her madness would be rewarded? Shortly after Sarah, as if the two players had agreed beforehand, a man of impressive stature also walked out of the water. His muscles were protruding, his claws and fangs were visible and dripping with blood, while his golden and silver hair mane flapped around wildly because of the wind. Behind Jake, the corpse of one of the pterodactyl vultures was floating in the air. With each step forward he took, the body of the giant bird advanced an equal distance. He had already decided long ago that this would be his next meal. As he swept across the beach in search of what he needed to light a campfire, the artificial voice began to resonate in his ears. Congratulations, Jake Wilderth, for being the 10,127th contestant to reach the shore in just 13 days, 18 hours, 6 minutes, and 27 seconds. 10,000 points for passing the first event. 0 bonus points for not being in the top 10,000. Like Sarah a few moments earlier, Jake let out a raucous laugh, falsely embarrassed. He expected nothing less than such a result after his vendetta. Then the artificial voice began to speak again, and like the young woman before him, he stood agape in amazement. Who would have thought that being the culprit of a genocide could award so many points? Chapter 2, 39 Soul Glyph. Certain actions performed during the first round met the conditions for unlocking the feats category in advance. Each of these feats grant generous rewards and are free to be carried out throughout the participant's stay in the sanctuary bubble. Some of these exploits also have several milestones corresponding to bronze, silver, gold, platinum, and diamond. Feats accomplished during the first trial. Fish Hunter, gold 1,000 fish exterminated, equals /U003 next milestone, 9763/10,000. Shark Hunter, gold 1,000 sharks exterminated equals /U003 next milestone, 2438/10,000. Cetacean Hunters, gold 1,000 cetaceans exterminated equals /U003 next milestone, 1,327/10,000. Jellyfish Hunter, gold 1,000 jellyfish exterminated equals /U003 next milestone, 1477/10,000. Squid Hunter, Silver 100 squids exterminated equals backslash U003 next milestone 211/1000. Jake thought the artificial voice would stop speaking quickly, but that was just the beginning. After a while, even he began to find the report boring. The voice was so monotonous and caustic that he was close to falling asleep on the spot. Between two yawns, the list of his exploits continued to unfold, seemingly without end. Each accomplished feat was rewarded according to the milestone reached a significant amount of points. The bronze milestone awarded 100 points, while the silver and gold milestones awarded 1,000 and 10,000 points respectively. He didn't know how many points he had, but his oracle device would update his score after each new achievement. Jake was rather frustrated by this first event, because despite all the sea monsters he had eliminated, to the point of becoming completely indifferent to these predators that were usually a nightmare for normal people, not one of these monsters had dropped a single ether filament. Above all, his bracelet had been practically useless during this first event. The oracle system seemed incapable of predicting anything inside this sanctuary bubble, as if it was out of bounds. This explained the many difficulties he had struggled with in the beginning. But even switching to a prediction model based on his own senses, the truth was that at his level the shadow guide wasn't much better than his own reflexes. Since the water was murky only a few meters away, his only visibility was from his extrasensory perception, and with his current intelligence, he was more than capable of anticipating and predicting what these monsters were capable of if they entered his mental domain. Beyond that, he was blind, and so was the oracle, unless he used his scanner extensively, whose range was limited to 50 meters. Without selecting targets, the cost in ether of a multidirectional scan went up to 50 points. It was a cost he could afford to spend, but it was out of the question. So Jake had given free rein to his desire for revenge by retaliating against all the creatures that had tortured or devoured him without getting the slightest particle of ether. Fortunately, his ether intelligence, perception and extrasensory perception, as well as his spirit body, had all made great progress. These stats being the most difficult to improve, he was overall quite happy. As he wondered how he was going to gain ether in his ordeal, his eyes widened in shock when he discovered that the amount of ether in his ether storage was increasing at an insane rate. The amount of ether he was earning corresponded exactly to the number of points he had been awarded for his feats. Meanwhile, the announcement of his exploits seemed to be almost complete. A few individual feats were referenced, but since he hadn't reached the corresponding milestones, he couldn't verify what they corresponded to. This feature was supposed to be unlocked later, or the objective of one of these exploits had to be reached for the feature to become available. In any case, all these points were a pleasant surprise for him who thought he was among the last to reach the island. Yet, when he heard the continuation of the speech of the artificial voice, Jake almost got an eargasm. The heck? Special achievements. Title: A fish in water. Gold: when you move in water, your hydrodynamics are increased by 100% and you can't get dehydrated. It is obtained by surviving more than 7 days at sea without assistance or equipment, all without setting foot on land or a ship. At the time the title was announced, the ether around him suddenly condensed under the effect of an unknown mystical force and shaped into an intricate pattern resembling a kind of glyph. Unfortunately, the pattern seemed too simple to match an etheric rune, but that did not mean that there was none. The etheric runes contained in a bloodline or the etheric code were so tiny that they were undetectable and impossible to observe without alien technology far beyond that of Earth. After a few seconds, the glyph had taken shape, emitting a soft golden light. It then floated towards him, as if attracted to something, and when it touched his soul, there was a flash of light, and it was gone. When Jake was able to open his eyes again, he didn't feel any particular difference, but the title "A Fish in Water" was now part of his passive skills. His soul, which until then had been unattributed, now contained the words "1 gold soul glyph," although the rest had not changed. "It's amazing that you got a soul glyph so easily," she congratulated him warmly. "This will be extremely useful for your fourth ordeal." Oh, he was curious, but this was no time to ask questions. Satisfied with the generosity of the sanctuary bubble, Jake was about to count his points when the artificial voice resounded again. Title: Apex Ocean Predator. gold your body emits an extremely intimidating aura to other sea creatures, causing them to overestimate you. Also works against evolvers with the bloodline of a sea creature. Is obtained by exterminating all ocean apex predators in an area to the point where the few survivors recognize their inferiority and flee upon your sight. This title is a prerequisite for the title, Apex Predator, Platinum. Ugh. It was much more than Jake could endure. When the new soul glyph merged with his soul, he burst out laughing. Well done to all of you, you fried fish shit. Serves you right for trying to eat me. He spat on the giant shark behind him to emphasize his point. Even after having exterminated the sharks from leagues around to extinction, he was still not appeased. If Jake hadn't begun to get thirsty and prey started to become scarce, he probably would have continued indefinitely. Because, yes, Jake had discovered another secret as he chased all those sea monsters to the point where they didn't know where to flee and hide. This ocean was not infinite. When Jake had chased yet another plesiosaurus so far from shore, he had hit an invisible force field that felt like an electroshock. No matter how hard he had tried to break or circumvent this restriction, the force field proved to be impassable. The sad reality was that the ocean disappearing on the horizon, the sun and the sky were probably illusions. Recalling that the second ordeal was also of the simulation type, it had taken him a while to figure out why it was a simulation. The world seemed too real, and if it wasn't for the revivals in the past that brought him back to the initial moment and the fact that he wasn't getting any ether by eliminating monsters, he probably wouldn't have suspected anything. Nevertheless, after this discovery, he had realized that no matter what he felt inside this sanctuary bubble, it was not his real body, but only his consciousness that was roaming this world. This explained why only his psychic stats had progressed in spite of all his physical efforts. After that, Jake waited silently in the hope of getting a third title, but the artificial voice remained silent. About a minute later, he heard some noise coming from the jungle, and the monotone voice resounded again, the notification also appearing in his mind. The second stage will begin shortly, in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Objective of the second trial: spend a night on the island. Taking refuge in the ocean does not count and will result in immediate elimination. Jake frowned when he heard the warning, but he was not upset. After spending a whole week immersed in seawater without dying once, it was obvious that it would be far too simple if the trial left him that option. Not to mention a single night, he could certainly survive the entire ordeal in the ocean if no new predators popped up. Fine, he sighed. To be honest, after the carnage he had just perpetrated, he didn't really care about the threats the island had in store for him. What was the worst that could happen to him? Dying. The sooner he finished this second trial, the sooner he could move on to the next one. He had fallen behind, and now he had to make up for the wasted time. On this reflection, the palm trees at the edge of the jungle began to sway again, and the rustle of trees reached his ears. The ground shook slightly, and a flock of small birds soared out of the jungle. Thump, thump, thump. Not daring to believe what his imagination suggested, he peered into the lush jungle with expectations, his eyes sparkling like a child's in front of his Christmas presents. As expected, a deafening roar between that of an elephant, a tiger, and a whale resounded, and a creepy creature straight out of his memories emerged from the jungle, uprooting a palm tree in its path. It was a T-Rex. A fucking Tyrannosaurus Rex. Chapter 240 Sleepless Night. This T-Rex was undoubtedly a T-Rex, but after further observation some differences could still be observed. In addition to being much smaller than an adult Tyrannosaurus that could be up to 13 meters long and weigh 8 tons, its scales were covered with a plumage reminiscent of a parrot. A small red crystal was inserted in the middle of its forehead, giving it a more than bizarre look. I thought this dinosaur would look different, Jake lampooned inwardly. Whatever. He didn't pretend to be an expert on dinosaurs, and even the most eminent paleontologists on Earth had never seen one except for modern birds. There were all sorts of theories on the subject, and it was highly likely that this T-Rex had little to do with those who had trodden the Earth millions of years ago. Nevertheless, this multicolored feathered T-Rex shared a common point with the version of the Tyrannosaurus with which he had been cradled since childhood. Both were carnivorous. Upon seeing Jake, who only reached up to half of his hind legs, the bipedal dinosaur straightened up slightly and began to sniff the air with curiosity. A new but enticing scent came to him, and the prehistoric monster immediately began to salivate, its lips curling up to reveal a row of sharp, yellowish teeth. Roar. As if the creature wanted to communicate its excitement to the rest of the island or to intimidate it, a cloud of foul-smelling sputum showered Jake's body, which stood less than 10 meters away. Smelling the viscous slime, probably carrying all sorts of bacteria from another time, the vein in his temple began to throb and his body quivered. If you want to die, you've come to the right purse. As Jake was about to respond with a yell full of foul insults of his own, a mind-boggling scene occurred. The giant trees further into the jungle began to sway and wobble again, and another cry rang out. It was a high-pitched, almost cute scream. The kind of call that a kitten crossed with a canary could make if it wanted hugs or kibble. Except that this meow was about 100 times more loud. Upon hearing this sound, the famished dinosaur suddenly changed its attitude, as if it had just remembered why it was on the beach in the first place. Indeed, it was common knowledge that the dominant predators tended to stay in the heart of the land, where prey was more abundant. There was still the possibility that this T-Rex was an excellent fisherman, but this was unlikely given its anatomy. Its extremely short and disproportionately short crooked forearms and plump body ensured that this dinosaur must have been a poor swimmer. Jake believed that this dinosaur could certainly swim by undulating like a snake, but next to megalodons or mosasaurs, it was a sitting duck. Crossing a river was still manageable, but hunting in the open sea was out of question. So the only logical explanation left was that it was running away from something. Jake had thought that the sanctuary bubble wanted to put them to the test right away, to the point where he was confronted to a T-Rex a few seconds only after the start of the second trial, but that didn't seem to be the case anymore. Confirming his doubts, the feathered Tyrannosaurus gave Jake one last tearful look of regret and then turned his huge, awkward body in another direction, choosing to run along the beach without paying attention to him. A few minutes later, its silhouette had almost disappeared in the distance, and the high-pitched cry had not resounded again. Jake was finally getting ready to chill out by plucking and cooking that pterodactyl vulture he was carrying with him when a heart-rending cry of misery broke the silence. In the direction from which the T-Rex had fled, a flock of panicked birds were chirping and circling in all directions. Where the T-Rex had been moments earlier, a puddle of blood gorged the white sand. Despite the distance, Jake's eyesight was sharp enough to see the scratch marks in the sand, as if the T-Rex had tried to grab something when its attacker dragged it into the jungle. There was no trace of the T-Rex or its attacker. The action had lasted only a second or two at the most, and the proud Tyrannosaurus had been totally unable to defend itself, as vulnerable as a mouse to a cat. At this thought, the memory of his encounter with his first digester came back to him, and a shiver ran down his spine. He thought he had overcome this visceral fear all along, but it was not a memory so easy to forget. At least he had killed that rat back then. At first, Jake thought he was safe on the beach after the carnage he had just perpetrated in the ocean, but after that incident, he was not so confident. The scariest thing for Jake was not a monster that was impossible to fight, but the unknown. As long as he didn't know what was the thing that defeated the T-Rex, he couldn't move forward. Nevertheless, Jake was a pragmatic person. With a deep breath, he pulled himself together and regained his usual phlegm. At worst, he would die and the trial would start all over again. He therefore decided to stick to his original plan. In spite of what had just happened, Jake had a clear view of the beach while he was unaware of the monstrosities and dangers of the jungle that lay before him. Further away, slightly higher up, he could see some plains and even further away a mountain range, but it was not something he could explore in such a short time. He just had to survive one night, and that was exactly what he intended to do. Maybe a normal person who had badly failed his first ordeal would have been forced to build himself a shelter or look for a natural refuge to spend the night safely, but Jake didn't have those concerns. With his constitution and vitality, he could easily go several days without sleep, and to be quite frank, he had spent the entire week hunting in the water without much rest. From time to time, he would take very short naps, dozing off for a few minutes, and that was usually enough to invigorate him for half a day. His strategy for his first night on the island was clear. Jake would spend a sleepless night on the beach without closing his eyes so that he could react to any surprise that the event had in store for him. On the contrary, He was quite enthusiastic about the idea of a new fight and was determined to take up these new challenges with fervor. If he had to die in combat, so be it. After a few attempts, he was confident in his ability to find a solution. Since he didn't have the leisure to procrastinate anymore, Jake had become a man of action, and he carried out his plan at once. His first thought was to gather wood for a campfire, but he changed his mind. The smoke from such a fire would herald for kilometers around that a human was camping here, and this would force him to enter the jungle to collect the wood. He was not afraid to face a dinosaur like this T-Rex or the predator that dragged it into the jungle, but if all the predators in the area attacked him at the same time, he would have no chance of getting out alive or even escape. The mental suppression had all but disappeared since his spirit body had reached level 3, but the same could not be said for his body. The gravity was 4 times that of the Earth, and after spending so much time in the water, his body was not prepared for such a change. His steps were heavy and clumsy, even though he was recovering quickly. Because of this gravity, his advantage had been significantly reduced, and he realized that this T-Rex was more robust than it seemed to maintain such a speed. The pterodactyl vulture resting like a mountain of feathers behind him was also a potential source of trouble. The metallic smell of blood was beginning to permeate now that the corpse was on land, and it was most likely this smell that had attracted the feathered T-Rex. Thus, Jake used his claws to cut out the piece of meat he needed. Then, with the help of his telekinesis, he carried the carcass a few kilometers away by running along the beach and threw it into the ocean before returning to its original point. He then thermally agitated the piece of meat in his hands like a microwave and started to feast. The meat tasted like rotten poached chicken, but it was more than enough to fill his stomach. Full, Jake waited patiently for nightfall, sitting cross-legged at the shore. The regular metronome of the waves had something relaxing about it, and no predators showed up. The fake blue sky gradually gave way to dusk, and then to night. In contrast to the dark sky enveloping the asteroid, a few stars gave off a semblance of light, but there was no moon to bring true brightness. As night fell, Jake continued to wait for an enemy to appear before him, but nothing happened. As the night progressed, Jake became more and more nervous and vigilant, but the island was still as calm as ever. Then, without knowing exactly when and why, Jake closed his eyes for a brief moment to rest his dry eyes. But when he opened them again, he was startled. The sun was high in the sky again, and he stood soaking wet on the beach, the intact corpse of the pterodactyl vulture silently levitating behind him. A few seconds later, a roar sounded and the palm trees began to tip over, finally giving way to a T-Rex with multicolored feathers. Jake was flabbergasted and tried to remember the exact sequence of events from last night, but he quickly gave up. It was a waste of time. He hadn't slept a wink all night except when he closed his eye for a few seconds to rest his sight. It was impossible to attack him in such a short time without him being able to react, and yet he had to face the facts. Last night he died. Chapter 241, The Mysterious Death. Facing the multicolored feathered T-Rex from the day before, Jake felt no particular fear or curiosity. Indifferent to the roar of the starving dinosaur, Jake was sputtered on again, and the giant biped flew off in the same direction as the day before. The strident cry between that of a kitten and a canary also rang out again, and as expected, the Tyrannosaurus uttered a long cry of agony and resentment a few moments later when the predator chasing it caught up with it. This time Jake was very careful not to look away. It was a predator capable of eliminating a T-Rex in less than a second, and this would give him a better idea of the dangers he would have to overcome on this island. Focused as ever and with his eyes squinted to better see the details, Jake watched for the lightning assault of the mysterious predator, and he was not disappointed. A hand with 6 clawed fingers emerged from the ferns lining the jungle and grabbed the tail of the T-Rex. Then the hand disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, dragging with it the helpless Tyrannosaurus that tried to cling to the sand as best it could in vain. The scene might have seemed trivial at first, but it couldn't have been more creepy. The T-Rex was running along the beach along the edge of the jungle and should have sensed the attack coming. The other confusing aspect was that this hand was clearly not that of a human. The hand was the size of an umbrella, and each finger was as thick as the forearm of an average adult male. The skin was dark, close to that of coal, but was not covered with scales, hair, or feathers. The claws were yellowish and covered with dried blood, but incredibly sharp. Even then, if that was all there was, Jake would not have been so puzzled. After all, a predator capable of spooking a T-Rex had to be at least that terrifying. A large size was more plausible than a small one, and the fact that no venom or ether ability was involved was actually quite reassuring. No, the most disturbing element of this action was actually what occurred on that hand. When the hand grabbed the tail of the T-Rex by exposing itself to the sun's rays, the skin immediately began to boil and then putrefy, revealing dark green blood. In addition to the creature's incredible physical strength and speed of execution, the reason for the brevity of the assault was clearly because it had no choice. Sunlight was its greatest foe. This was good news for Jake, as it meant that as long as he stayed on the beach, he would not have much to fear during the day. The real challenge was at nightfall. However, it was precisely during the night that he had died, without knowing how. It was certainly not this predator with a cold hand that had put an end to his life, or at least he would have been able to defend himself. Yet, from the scene he had just witnessed, it was clear that this predator was rather well adapted to hunting at night. During the day, this monster would have to avoid exposing itself to the light by resting in caves, caverns, or burrows. Even if the creature remained active during the day, it should have resided in the heart of the jungle, where the foliage of the trees was the densest. Taking such a risk to hunt this T-Rex was rather unexpected. Either this predator was inexplicably stupid, or he too had no choice but to hunt under these circumstances. In the second case, it was a very bad omen for the rest of the trial. Either way, there was nothing Jake could do at this point. Sure, he could take the risk of exploring the jungle, but first he had to figure out what had killed him. There was still the possibility that he may have fallen asleep due to lack of vigilance, and in that case this first death would be his fault. To be sure, he had to spend a second night on the beach. Therefore, Jake cut a piece of meat from the pterodactyl behind him once again, and then like the day before got rid of the remains a few kilometers further on. He then calmly waited for the rest of the day to pass and for the sun to give way to the few stars he had observed the previous night. It was extremely boring, but he had no choice. To pass the time, he tried to generate his ether core, but he felt that in this simulation it would be a waste of time. It was still a good training for him, though, and he had also started reading the manual containing the basics of the mirror universe genetics. This manual was not as complicated to understand and master as the ether manual, but the amount of data contained in it was massive. As with the etheric code and the etheric runes within it, the genetics might seem simple at first glance, but it was actually immensely complex. Just by taking the 4 nitrogenous bases that made up the DNA of all living things on Earth, it was possible to obtain an incredible diversity in terms of morphology and abilities. Earth's geneticists could not claim to know everything about the subject, even in 2106. Except that the genetics of the mirror universe was not limited to DNA and its 4 standard nucleotides. To begin with, not all life forms were carbon-based, but more importantly, some life forms could only exist in conjunction with their etheric code, or even only thanks to their etheric code. For example, on Enya and Esia's planet, elemental spirits based on fire, water, lightning, or earth were quite common. How could a flame spirit have a genetic code? The DNA would have melted immediately. Artificial intelligence forms were also considered as living beings from the moment their soul assumed its shape, and naturally, their genetic heritage rested in the chip containing their program. Thus, there were obviously other ways of encoding an individual's genetic heritage, and DNA was only one of these ways. In the end, reading this manual was a lengthy process, which would take much more than a few days to be fully understood. Eventually night fell, and Jake stopped multitasking between training and reading. To avoid inadvertently falling asleep, he also forced himself to stand up and started pacing. According to him, it should be impossible for someone to fall asleep standing up while walking. To really put all the chances on his side, he even started shadowboxing in the void, trying to remember everything he had learned during his first ordeal. While Jake was repeating the moves and katas he remembered, the night gradually passed. Listening, he was comforted to hear that the jungle was not silent. A few birds were hooting, the singing of some kind of cricket or cicada reached him, and every once in a while the roar or bellow of a creature would echo in the distance, reminding him that the night was not a danger to all the creatures on the island. Always vigilant, Jake did not relax. He continued to move, even allowing himself to go jogging by the sea. Still nothing. Was he just unlucky the night before? It was impossible. The more time passed, the more nervous Jake grew. At the slightest rustle, Jake would turn around, but each time it was a false alarm. It was under these strange conditions that the night passed, until the first rays of the sun reappeared. As miraculous as it seemed, he had actually survived the night. But all of a sudden, as he watched the red sun rise with incredible relief, he sensed that something was wrong, as if things were not as they should be. His heart began to beat faster and faster in his chest, and he began to hyperventilate, as if he felt out of place in his own body. His mind instinctively searched for a way out of this problem, and when he found it, he thoughtlessly grasped it. Gasp! When Jake reopened his eyes, his body was still soaked by the sea water, and the corpse of a pterodactyl vulture was gently levitating behind him. A roar between that of an elephant, a tiger, and a whale resounded, and a moment later, a hungry T-Rex with multicolored feathers appeared before his eyes. I died again, he wondered suspiciously. This time there was no doubt about it. He hadn't fallen asleep. And yet, the end of that night had felt weird to him, but he couldn't say since when. His third resurrection had given him the impression of waking up from a lucid dream, not of dying. It was clear that camping on the beach would not allow him to solve this new enigma. He had not smelled anything unusual and had even used his skin twice to analyze the surroundings. There were subtle variations in the composition of the atmosphere, but nothing alarming. Regardless, he could not ignore the possibility that he had already been unconscious when he had used his scanner, in which case that action had been pointless, but the ether had definitely been debited. So on that third morning, Jake took the only decision he could make. Raising his hand with a sinister aura that Darth Vader would not have envied, he clenched his fist. With its trachea, arteries, and heart compressed, the T-Rex was choked within seconds. Once the dinosaur lay unconscious, Jake trailed the monster to him, then stood idly by, waiting for its pursuer to come after its prey. He was going to enter the jungle through the big gate. Chapter 242, First Clue. With the unconscious T-Rex at his feet, Jake eagerly awaited the arrival of the predator that had gutted the dinosaur the previous 2 times. He didn't know if the monster would take the bait, but it was worth a try. Suddenly, the howling between a meow and the chirping of a canary pierced the silence of the jungle again, triggering the flight of another flock of birds. The foliage of the trees wavered and capsized as the creature passed by, allowing Jake to predict its arrival. Then it was silent again, and the trees and bushes became still once more. Jake's fine hearing could hear a wheeze, close to a rattle a few meters in front of him, but the monster remained hidden behind the trees and bushes, sheltered from the light. The man and the beast stared at each other for a long time without really being able to distinguish anything, but they could feel each other's presence. In the end, the predator did not fall for it. The green eyes of the creature, the only visible part of the monster, emitted a ghostly aura, giving the impression that 1-foot's soul was exposed and vulnerable, but their owner never took action. After a few minutes, the creature produced a long, plaintive whimper, and then the heavy footsteps begun to recede. Jake breathed a sigh of relief, but also of regret. He wished the monster had attacked on the beach. This now forced him to move on to Plan B, which was to enter the jungle to pursue the monster and gather clues as to why he had died. Jake was confident that he could survive an entire night if he buried himself underground using his Murtharian skills, but he felt that it was absolutely necessary to solve this riddle if he wanted to go further in the ordeal. The first trial had already proved that despite its apparent impossibility, it was possible to overcome it by redoubling his efforts. After all his attempts, Jake was now quite confident that he could reach the shore with his eyes closed. So this second trial couldn't be impossible, and there had to be an explanation for what had happened to him. Since he no longer intended to camp on the beach, he might as well treat himself to a real feast. If predators were to show up because of the smell, at least he would have confirmation that it was definitely an idea to avoid. Approaching the edge of the jungle, he retrieved some wood with his claws and lit a campfire. He had neither lighter nor flint, but with his ability to thermally agitate the material, it was only a formality. Not forgetting that the T-Rex was still alive, Jake finished off the dinosaur by cutting out its heart and then began to dissect it. He did the same with the pterodactyl vulture and made skewers with the two different meats to experiment. Half an hour later, the meat was perfectly roasted, and he was finally able to eat a real meal since his arrival in the sanctuary bubble. The bird meat had a taste of chicken, but more pronounced. The kind of difference in taste that could be found between pork and wild boar meat. As for the T-Rex meat, it turned out to be close to chicken as well, but it was dry and stringy. In addition to needing good teeth to chew this meat, it had a peculiar, unpleasant smell that he was not used to. In conclusion, Jake eventually abandoned T-Rex skewers by crossing this dinosaur off the list of edible game on the island. As for the carcasses of the two monsters, he didn't waste any time this time getting rid of the remains since he had no intention of staying there anymore. If other predators were attracted by the smell after his departure, it would not cause him any harm. However, out of curiosity, he removed the small red crystal embedded in the monster's glabella. At first glance, the object looked like a strength red crystal, but the nature of it was completely different. When the T-Rex was alive, a faint glow emanated from the crystal, but this glow had faded away as soon as the dinosaur had passed out, and was completely extinguished by the time Jake had killed it. Inspecting the object with his spirit body, he didn't feel any uniqueness, but the result was different when he used the scan of his bracelet. Red Soul Crystal, T-Rex, the seat of the T-Rex's soul. It's an artificial object that was grafted to this Tyrannosaurus after its birth, and which conditions its behavior. The object feeds on the surrounding ether and other traces of minerals present on the island, including flintium, orxanium, and naquat. Other functions: preserve the integrity of a soul and the memories of a creature after its death. Detection. Jake was taken aback reading this. Gee, what do you think? The hologram of a young woman with short black hair and blood-red irises materialized in front of him. It was the first time since the beginning of the ordeal that she appeared physically at his side. Scrupulously observing the crystal through Jake's senses, she responded nonchalantly. It is indeed a Zorian crystal. If my memories are good, they use it to trace the movements of their creations, but also to configure the behavior of these monsters. Somewhere on the island, there should be a biological factory or a laboratory mass producing these creatures. Jake frowned for a short time, but regained his peace of mind before long. He was in a simulation, so those monsters were fake anyway. No need for labs or factories to create these creatures. Besides, he doubted that this factory could kill him unless it was producing a lethal poison impossible to detect at night. Unexpectedly, another idea came to him, and he spontaneously asked the young woman, "Can their creators see us through these crystals?" She hesitated for a few seconds, her mouth opening and then closing twice. Then finally she conceded tersely, "It's possible." Fuck. Having no secrets for the Oracle was already exceedingly hard to accept, and now he was also a circus freak that the owners of the sanctuary bubble were free to observe as they wished. A bit like in a reality show he hadn't chosen to participate in. In any case, this did not solve the problem of his unexplainable death. Now that he was full, it was time to enter this damn jungle. Not knowing what to do with the crystal in his hand, he had to make up his mind to throw it away. For better or for worse, no clothes had been provided for their arrival on the island, so he had no pockets, bags, or storage for the crystal. If he survived that first night, he would certainly take care of these details, but for the moment, it was not his priority. As his gaze lingered on the crystal one last time, he realized a detail to which he had not paid much attention. To what does this red color refer? Jake inquired in a doubtful tone. The scan report doesn't explain it, but it does take the trouble to point it out. If the color didn't matter, a simple soul crystal would have sufficed. This time, the young woman serving as an AI came up with an answer. The two most likely hypotheses are that the material composing the crystal is responsible for this color and is important enough to be mentioned, or that the properties and functions of the crystal differ according to this color. In both cases, it will be necessary to pay attention while hunting other creatures on the island. Jake nodded in agreement. The sea animals didn't have any. This shows that things are different on the island. You should still keep the crystal until nightfall, she advised cautiously. Who knows if this object is of any importance in explaining what's going on here. All right. It wasn't convenient for him, but he could always use it as a stone to knock out his enemies. The crystal itself weighed only a few hundred grams, and although the object was rather warm to the touch, it was insignificant for a Murtharian like him. Holding the crystal firmly in his hand, Jake strode slowly towards the jungle, his spirit body deployed at its maximum range. If the predator from before or some other, even more vicious creature ambushed him as soon as he entered, it would be too late to regret. A while later, the white sand and the comforting rays of the sun had abandoned him, and a dense, dark jungle filled his sight. The density of bushes, grasses, and shrubs was such that it was almost impossible to move around. If the T-Rex and the monster chasing it hadn't uprooted everything in their path, it probably would have taken a considerable amount of time just to advance a few meters. Anyway, Jake had survived his entrance into the jungle, and it was now time to start investigating. Following the path traced by the footsteps of the T-Rex and its predator, he prudently began his journey to the heart of the island. Chapter 243, Taking a Nap in the Jungle. His jungle hike turned out to be much less hectic and exhilarating than Jake had envisioned at first. In addition to not encountering a single monster, the air was humid and warm, and the flora was so dense that he felt like he was wearing earplugs. The field of birds that he could hear easily from outside the jungle were almost muffled once inside, as if a thick wall of leaves separated him from the tall branches where those singing birds were perched. Each step forward was a real hassle, forcing him to contort himself back and forth to avoid rubbing against brambles and bushes. The T-Rex and its charcoal-colored predator obviously had skin thick enough that they didn't need to worry about it. Without his machete, Jake had to use his claws to work his way through, and despite their sharpness, the force he could deploy with his fingers alone was limited. At first, he did not intend to sacrifice his time to craft a weapon, but he had to face the facts. At this rate, he would have advanced only a few kilometers by the end of the day. If he just traveled along the paths created by the T-Rex or other massive creatures, chances were that he would miss important clues. On the other hand, these animals could also carry key evidence. No path was to be overlooked. He could, naturally, move underground, but one did not prevent the other. Sacrificing a few minutes, he made himself a new machete by manipulating and heating the earth beneath his feet. He didn't know if the object would be strong enough, but he had an easy solution to this issue. Jake was not short of ether at the moment. He already had more than 400,000 ether points before the ordeal even started, and after the reward of the first trial, it now peaked at 764,237 points. It was a huge sum that would have made him dream a few days earlier, but which no longer triggered the slightest emotion in him. After all, just a glance at the merchandise in the Oracle store would be enough to make anyone despair. Even though it was a simulation and he didn't know if the ether would be returned to him, he still spent 500 ether points, which he converted into 100 gray ether points. This particular type of ether improved the sharpness and solidity of edged weapons, and that was exactly what he needed. With this ether, even a twig could compete with the best sword, not to mention a machete made of cooled lava. With no knowledge of blacksmithing or the composition of the ground, Jake expected the result to be poor, but his surprise was huge when he discovered that his new machete was better than the first one he had gotten from his uncle. The new machete resembled an obsidian blade, and glitter like particles of different colors covered the object. Even before the gray ether was added, this new weapon was already great. It was not worth the one forged from Wormack's claw, but it was still a more than decent weapon. How weird. Curious, he scanned the ground under his feet with his bracelet, but the result gave him little information. Tropical jungle soil, mainly composed of red and yellow laterites. Poor in potassium, calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus, contains oxides of aluminum and iron. Presence of humus, feces, urine, dried blood. Traces of gold, iridium, flintium, orxamium, naquat. Ugh. Jake paid attention to the last words of the report. This was the second time these three unknown elements were mentioned. The first time was by analyzing the composition of the red crystal containing the soul of the T-Rex. The first time he had not been able to draw any particular conclusion since this crystal was a mysterious object he had never encountered before, but this time the names of these three materials had appeared again when talking about the island's soil. I have no recollection of these materials, she intervened of her own accord, smelling the question he was about to ask her. The best would be to find a sample of these materials of sufficient size to make the scan report more accurate. That's what I had in mind, but I don't think it's going to be that easy. Jake sighed. The important factor was that he had a decent weapon now. Armed with his new machete, his progress through the jungle became faster, and when he came up against a wall of brambles and vegetation that was much too thick, he simply vanished into the ground to cross the obstacle. Compared to the first trial in the ocean, this one allowed him to put his Murtharian skills to good use, which greatly reduced the apparent difficulty of the trial. Nevertheless, the hike did not remain peaceful and relaxed for long. After having progressed about a kilometer, the fauna having fled because of the noise created by the T-Rex, and its pursuer began to reoccupy the place. Or maybe it had never left. As Jake was nonchalantly cutting through the vegetation in his path, what he thought was a large branch suddenly deformed in his hand when he tried to move it away. Unaware of what strange plant he was dealing with, he raised his trusty machete and cut it down without hesitation. Hiss! The thick branch was nicely severed, but instead of the characteristic thump of a falling log, a blue blood spray splashed across his face as the raging, pain-stricken whistle of a snake pierced the silence. With half of its body amputated, the snake had no intention of retreating. The rest of its body, which was wrapped around several high branches, suddenly pounced on the culprit with its jaws wide open. Jake had not let up and easily avoided the surprise attack by leaning back. Finding itself without a target, the giant snake continued its fall, and when its head with its fangs exposed passed in front of Jake's head, the culprit took the opportunity to cut it off once more. A snake's head followed by the intact half of the snake fell on top of each other, the snake's serpentine part wrapping around the severed head like a long turd would have done. Jake stood perplexed for a short while, and then stepped over the corpse before resuming his journey. Still, he didn't forget to scan the creature for clues. Orcsin boa, juvenile, a giant snake from the native planet of Zorians, able to change the color and texture of its scales to camouflage itself. Its body can grow back as long as no vital organs have been compromised. Its gaze has hypnotizing properties, while its blood has hallucinogenic and sedative properties. Usually hunts its prey by constricting it to death, but also naive predators who believe they can feed on its flesh with impunity. When Jake read the report, his face froze. His face and torso were covered with the creature's blue blood. He hastily wiped the blood from his face, but without any clothes or rags, it was a wasted effort. Within seconds, the blood had dried. Soon his vision became distorted, and he began to hear strange bells. Phosphenes began to shimmer in his field of vision, and his body became heavier. Phew! F.A. thud. When Jake reopened his eyes an undetermined time later, he was surprised not to find the white sandy beach and the feathered T-Rex. Observing the space around him, the dead body of the snake was still there, but no predators or insects had approached it. His head was still spinning, but its motor skills had largely recovered. This time he was lucky, but he might not be able to say the same next time. It was a hell of a poison. Thanks to his Murtharian bloodline, his body was much stronger than normal, and combined with his current ether stats, it was impressive that a simple sedative could make him lose consciousness for half a day. He had not consumed any blood. Only his skin had come into contact with it. With his bracelet on, he determined that he had been unconscious for most of the day. The sun was already about to set. Because of a cheap snake, he had literally lost a day's worth of research in a fraction of a second. As Jake was musing over the course of the action, he realized that the snake's camouflage involved much more than color and texture. As he cut his way through with his machete, his spirit body had always been deployed. In other words, he should have been able to easily differentiate the snake's etheric signature from that of the rest of the vegetation. Yet this was clearly not the case. This was the first time he had come across a wild creature capable of camouflaging its own etheric signature, and it deserved a special attention. This island most likely held some great secrets. As night was about to fall, it was too late to plan anything. Jake decided to wait there until dark. He also took the opportunity to scan himself in order to analyze the traces of poison in his system. Unfortunately, the result of the analysis was inconclusive, as his metabolism had completely eliminated the poison in question. However, the blue blood test turned out to be successful. Chapter 244. Can I just gather clues in peace? Orcsin boa's blood. Blood, whose core molecule of the red blood cells responsible for oxygen transport, is characterized by the presence of an orcsanium atom. In addition to conferring a better ability to transport oxygen, this atom is responsible for the sedative and hallucinogenic properties of the blood in question. There was definitely something wrong with these three minerals, or the Oracle system would not bother mentioning them so often. It was more of a correlation than real evidence at this point, but Jake felt it was not unlikely that this Orxanium was involved in his two previous deaths. Indeed, it was more than likely that he lost consciousness during the night, and the fact that he was unable to realize it suggested that he was indeed hallucinating or that it was so fast that he could not have realized it. However, there were flaws in this hypothesis. If Jake had actually been drugged to death by inhaling Orxanium particles or some other poison, analysis of his own status or the composition of the surrounding air would certainly have allowed him to detect these anomalies in time. The other troubling point was that he was perfectly aware that he had been poisoned when he had been in contact with the snake's blood. The loss of consciousness was certainly sudden, but it was preceded by distinctive auditory and visual hallucinations. The physical sensations were confusing enough for anyone to realize that they were no longer in their normal state. In contrast, his two previous deaths were a real mystery. If he had really been the victim of a hallucination that sent him into a lucid dream, the hallucination must have been so flawless that there were no signs of the transition from a normal state to a sleepy one. Only the approach of death in the last few seconds had driven his body to panic, but at that very moment, he was probably just choking. The last and most important point was that being sprayed with blood was not enough to take his life. Jake had taken a long nap, but he had already fully recovered. Clearly, Orxanium in these quantities did not have what it took to deal with him. In any case, it was a first clue, and Shi's recommendation made even more sense. The sooner he would find samples of these minerals of sufficient size, the sooner he would get more detailed information about them. His scan was currently LVL3. This function being unlocked at Oracle rank 3 of private first class, and being currently only at rank 5. His scan should only have been LVL3, but thanks to the bracelet he had absorbed during his first ordeal, the function had been improved once again. The scan range had not changed, but the information obtained was supposed to be more accurate. Jake couldn't imagine what kind of bullshit the other players were getting from their scans, but there was no doubt that the Oracle system was eager to limit their access to information. It was only with respect to the digesters that the Oracle was surprisingly magnanimous. During this brief moment, the sun had finished setting, and Jake found himself in almost total darkness. The light from the few fake stars in the simulation was completely blocked by the tree's canopy to the point that he could barely see the tip of his nose. He thought he would have to depend on his extrasensory perception to carry on his exploration, but at that very moment, two strange phenomena occurred. First, the red crystal containing the soul of the T-Rex and the blue blood of the snake scattered on the ground began to glow. Like phosphorescent stones, a soft red and blue light radiated faintly over a few meters of radius. And secondly, restless roars began to resound from all directions. These roars, squeals, and chirpings were heavy with threat and carried an unbridled rage within them, as if each of these animals had just met its nemesis. Hardened by his battles in the ocean, Jake only raised a troubled eyebrow, but there wasn't much he could do about it. He still didn't know how he was going to survive that night, and all he could do was bite the bullet and move on. Hi-hi-hi-hi. As he picked up his new machete and the T-Rex crystal to conserve a source of light, a four-legged creature with the distracting snicker of a hyena pounced on him out of nowhere. The monster was fast, and the contrast between the darkness and the crystal's brightness prevented him from clearly distinguishing its features. As a result, Jake only had time to raise his weapon to intercept the attack, and the momentum of the creature's charge toppled him to the ground. The shock of the tackle momentarily took his breath away, but the monster's fangs missed their target as they cracked on contact with his blade. Yelping, the rabid animal began to scratch and lacerate him in a frenzy to overpower this miserable human who dared to resist him. Jake ignored the blood-stained scratches and focused on the creature's eyes. Its eyes glowed with a light comparable to the crystal in its free hand, and it could not have been a mere coincidence. With his free hand holding the crystal, he punched the beast in the face, which momentarily stopped the creature's frenzied attacks. Then with his mind, he launched an assault on the monster's nervous system. With the current level of his spirit body, Jake thought he could do it easily, but it turned out that the beast's uncontrolled rage made it almost completely immune to his attempt to control it. The ether inside the monster rendered its body unbreakable. The mind struggle between man and beast seemed to last an eternity, but actually lasted less than a second. When Jake realized that the monster was impossible to control, he immediately switched to telekinesis, then whipped the air bilaterally to send a violent blast of wind through the monster's ear canals. The fury that inhabited the creature vanished instantly under the effect of the shock wave as it staggered back and forth. With no more need to defend himself, Jake wrapped himself around one of the clawed legs like a ground combat specialist, and then with a twist broke its paw. Rower. Not allowing himself to be distracted, he did the same with the other front paw. Then finally free to use his telekinesis freely, he managed to crush the monster's heart with a snap of his finger. In disbelief, the beast stopped struggling. Then the frenetic glow in its eyes disappeared along with the reddish light possessing it. The monster stood for a short while before collapsing on its side. Phew. The fight had been more dangerous than he had expected. None of the sea creatures were able to interfere with his telekinesis, and he had just learned from the front lines that not all life forms were vulnerable to it. If the spirit was strong enough, or if the monster possessed an innate control of its ether or a passive ability protecting it from such influences, internal telekinesis could fail. Jake differentiated between internal and external telekinesis. All of his ether skills were based on manipulating the ether under his control. If his mind was strong enough, he could easily control the ether in another person's body, thus leaving them completely at his mercy. Even without telekinesis, he could easily command that person's heart to stop beating or interrupt a vital function such as breathing. On the contrary, if the enemy had strong control over their own ether or the space around them, it became virtually impossible to use telekinesis directly on them. In this case, external manipulation would be required. Fortunately, this hyena could only protect its body from internal influences. The surrounding ether was perfectly controllable, and this was what Jake had used to blast its eardrums. Upon closer inspection, he was able to ascertain that the beast did indeed look like a hyena, except that it was as massive as a grizzly bear and had the fur of a woolly rhinoceros. The teeth, the stains, the Iroquois mane, and the laughter were very similar, however, except that in his memories, hyenas were not solitary animals and hunted in packs. They were shameless animals that would not even refrain from biting private parts to subdue their prey. Even a solitary lion or elephant was not immune to these gluttonous predators. As he was about to use his scan to verify his theory, multiple hi-hi-hi echoed a few meters away from him, interspersed with barking. Numerous pairs of red eyes pierced the darkness one by one, slowly shortening the distance. The rest of the pack had already surrounded him. Can I just gather some clues in peace? Jake proposed with a constipated smile. Of course, only the laughter of the hyenas answered him, and seconds later, the whole pack pounced on him, throwing him into another fight to the death. Chapter 245: The Red Blood. Despite the apparent urgency of the situation, it was not enough to scare Jake. Quite the opposite, it was just another challenge, and when the hyena pack pounced on him, he immediately kicked the nearest beast in the face. The monster's snout was crushed on impact, and the creature yelped in agony as Jake used the victim to carve out an escape route. As the hyena was probing its snout, whose red blood as phosphorescent as the crystal in its hand was pouring out abundantly, Jake rammed into it and continued his charge, jostling two other hyenas in its path. Once free of the encirclement, he finished off the hyena stunned at his feet with a slash of his machete. A spray of red blood spurted out, but this time he was careful not to get splashed. The blue blood of the snake had made him faint for half a day, and this red blood also had the unusual property of glowing at night. If he made such a mistake again, he might as well stop investing his points in intelligence and focus fully on his physical strength. The two other hyenas he had bumped into were already coming to their senses, and he took advantage of the short respite he had left to decapitate the nearest monster. Thanks to the gray ether, his blade was so sharp that he felt almost no difference on impact between skin, flesh, or bone. The sword flashed briefly, and an indignant head rolled to the ground with its tongue hanging out. This action had given the second hyena the time it needed to get up, and he felt more than he saw the creature charging from behind toward his crotch. As a shiver of anticipation ran through him, he swiveled on himself and threw his knee between the monster's two eyes. The beast's mouth was wide open, and instead of hitting the desired target, a fong was stuck in his leg, causing him to growl in pain. Now that the monster was holding his leg in its jaw, the monster did not intend to let go and instead clung to the ground firmly with its claws and pulled back. These mutant hyenas were far more intelligent and evolved than their counterparts on Earth, and their cooperation was impeccable. By the time Jake got rid of the hyena glued to his knee with a machete, he was surrounded again, and 3 more hyenas had pinned him to the ground in one leap. As experienced hunters, one of the animals went directly to his exposed carotid artery, while the other 2 targeted the arm holding the machete and the already injured leg, respectively. His arm gleaming with a red and orange halo, it suddenly accelerated, leaving an afterimage behind, and managed to slice the monster's head in half vertically before the monster could disarm it. He was then tackled by the other 2 hyenas. As for the hyena targeting his carotid artery, Jake simply forced his entire ether of strength and constitution into his forehead and threw a vicious headbutt, while shifting slightly. The beast went back where it came from, and an upward kick to the chin at full power sent it into orbit with an incredulous bark. The last hyena chomping on its leg was crushed just as the first one did, and another spurt of blood gushed into the air. Jake staggered slightly this time as he got up, and a significant amount of blood was spurting from his injured leg, but it was still not enough to endanger him. He had experienced much worse during his adventures in the ocean. Unfortunately, however brief the altercation may have been, it was more than enough to give the entire pack time to reposition themselves. Moreover, he had not had the time this time to avoid the blood spatter. His injured leg, his chest, and his cheek had been sprayed with hyena blood, and at night the red phosphorescent liquid made him appear ethereal, as if he was covered with ectoplasm. In one-on-one combat, he was able to use his multitasking ability to employ telekinesis while facing the enemy, but when facing several, he was already fully using this ability to react to different threats. In any case, it was too late to redo the action, and he could only grit his teeth in the hope that it would remain without consequence. Feeling his brief hesitation, the whole pack this time threw themselves at him like a swarm of bees on a field of flowers. Even for Jake, it was an impossible threat to overcome, and he let himself be swallowed up by the ground to escape. The hyenas collided with each other and crashed down where he was supposed to be. Soon a living mountain was formed, and the hyena at the bottom of the pile was mistakenly eaten alive without having time to cry out for injustice. The ferocity of the pack was such that it looked like they hadn't eaten for weeks. Jake, who had remained motionless several meters underground, was sweating profusely. He felt abnormally hot, and his heart was beating fast and hard. His breathing was also heavy despite his high constitution and vitality. "What's happening to me?" he wondered as he hurriedly reviewed his status. His vital parameters were good, but his body behaved as if he were angry, but not exactly, and the symptoms were getting worse. Hee roar. Above ground, the situation was also taking a new turn. The roar of what he thought was another large carnivorous dinosaur had just resounded nearby, and the laughter of the pack had just answered it fearlessly. While Jake was overwhelmed by an ever-growing irritation, his spirit body was also sending him alarming signals. The etheric signature of the hyenas above him was growing in intensity second by second, but also in volume. Controlling the air to blast a hyena's ears as he had done a moment earlier would now be virtually impossible at this distance. Soon the fight between the pack and the dinosaur broke out, and roars and growls of rage and suffering pierced the silence at regular intervals. The violence of the clash had already far surpassed that between Jake and the hyenas a few seconds earlier. Meanwhile, Jake was slowly dying of heat underground, which should have been impossible with his bloodline. Unable to bear any more, he climbed to the surface without realizing that a thought would have been enough to get him out of the ground. It was as if he was gradually plunging into a state of animalistic madness beyond the reach of any form of rationality. At the sight of the shining blood covering the bushes and jagged tree trunks around him, his stomach began to gurgle and his mouth to salivate. His translucent fangs, which he usually kept retracted, grew so long that they protruded out of his mouth disharmoniously, and his claws became as long as daggers. His muscles were also red and congested, as if he had been lifting weights for hours, and the air around him was distorted by the radiant heat of his body. By the time the hyenas and the dinosaur that turned out to be another feathered T-Rex noticed his presence, Jake had already sunk into a state of semi-consciousness. The monsters closest to him that were in a similar primal state immediately lost interest in the dinosaur and threw themselves at him. Several hyenas bit his legs, a few others aimed at his arms, and a last one, carried by his instinct, attacked his carotid artery once again. But where he had barely managed to neutralize a group of 3 assailants on the previous occasions, Jake stood still, indifferent to the attacks. The monster's fangs broke on an invisible force field a few millimeters from his skin, and an unbearable heat burned their eyes and mucous membranes, forcing them to let go. The same fiery, red eyes that inhabited these monsters appeared in Jake's extinguished gaze. Like an apathetic Terminator driven solely by a primal instinct for destruction, his red irises swept over his opponents as if they were mere pieces of meat. Suddenly, he opened his mouth and a peculiar sound escaped. It was an indescribable sound, a sound that should not have come out of the mouth of a living being. A sound reminiscent of the eruption of a volcano, an earthquake, and the destructive force of a supernova. When this sound escaped from his mouth, the glowing veins under his skin lit up as if someone had just thrown burning alcohol into a fire. The hyenas and the T-Rex, who were in a state of beastly rage, suddenly sobered up and stopped fighting. By tacit agreement, the pack and the dinosaur escaped in 2 different directions, but it was too late. A Jake, completely unconscious, pounced on them like a hellhound who had come down to deliver his judgment, and the monsters ruling over the jungle soon learned of the advent of a new apex predator on the island at their expense. Chapter 246 Success? When Jake regained consciousness a number of hours later, the spectacle before his eyes was very different from his last memory. Goodbye rabid hyenas and angry T-Rex. Instead, a desolate landscape had replaced them. The corpses of many other animals were scattered all over the place, more or less undamaged, wherever he looked. A sort of wildebeest with sharp teeth dangled with its tongue hanging on a high branch above it. Blood beaded down his skull with the regularity of a clock. A bird of prey with a wingspan of about 5 meters was nothing more than a disarticulated mass of flesh and bone at his feet, such as a kite that would have crashed into a mountain with the force of a hurricane. 20 meters behind him was a massive dinosaur, about 15 meters long, with most of its teeth and half of its ribs missing, and it had long since stopped breathing. The landscape was that way as far as his eyes could see. Jungle animals were not the only victims. The flora had not been spared either. The giant trees with trunks several meters in diameter had mostly survived, but their bark was charred black and they were often missing a good part of their branches or even a portion of their trunk or roots. The bushes, vines, creepers, and tall grasses were in poor condition, as if they had been trampled repeatedly by a herd of rabid elephants. The grass had been completely burned in some places, while smaller shrubs had been completely uprooted. In the midst of this scene of carnage, there was only one living creature, Jake. But alive did not mean unharmed. If these dinosaurs of all sizes and origins had ended up in this state, it didn't matter whether Jake was responsible or not. It was impossible for him to survive unharmed in the face of all these creatures. Yet he had to face the facts. All of these creatures, carnivorous and herbivorous, had been reduced to a state of fertilizer while he was still standing. Even though he was still disoriented, he was not so naive as to believe that he was not responsible for the hecatomb that had just taken place. His body had been completely repainted with blood from head to toe, and because of the phosphorescent blue and red blood of his victims, he resembled those primitive tribes practicing shamanic rites before going into battle. What I have done? Jake muttered as he tried to remember the events of last night hard. The virtual hologram of she suddenly materialized a few meters before him in answer. The expression of the young woman with the red irises were rather compassionate, but she did not seem as bewildered as him. Clearly, she had not lost consciousness during the night and had witnessed each one of his feats of arms. You fainted after being sprayed with hyena blood. The Oracle AI explained succinctly. She then recounted to him in a few words the course of events in the preceding hours. Apparently, after losing consciousness, he had transformed into another person, completely devoid of any self-preservation instincts. His intellect had completely faded away in favor of an amplified spirit body. All of his ether skills had reached a level out of all proportion to his real abilities, and his Murtharian bloodline had been doped as if it had gained 2 or 3 levels. This had amplified all of his bloodline skills, including the Murtharian trances, amplifying his physical and mental abilities upon contact with a fight or challenge. His fighting instincts had become so powerful that he had faced all these creatures with the meticulous efficiency of a battlefield veteran who had been on the battlefield for centuries. Each of his actions had been mere reflexes, but each of these reflexes responded perfectly to the situations of the moment. No wonder these hyenas were able to maintain a perfect team play despite the rage comparable to his own that consumed them. After she had finished recounting all of his exploits from the last few hours, Jake stood frozen in stupor for a long time, but a sudden vertigo brought him back to reality. Before he could even react, his forehead had already hit the soft ground in front of him. When he pushed on his forearms to get up, he realized that he simply didn't have the strength to do so. Every effort would make him dizzy, and he quickly began to pant as if he had just finished a long sprint. "Your arms," she suddenly screamed, pointing to the forearms he was supporting himself on in his attempt to straighten himself up. Following the young woman's finger, Jake stared at one of his hands, and his blood ran cold in his veins. The red and blue blood, which until then had glowed like any phosphorescent or fluorescent substance, had suddenly begun to lose their splendor. The glow emanating from the dried blood on his body had begun to dim, and the process was observable to the naked eye. Jake was wondering what the reason might be, but he immediately got his answer. The almost total darkness that had inhabited the jungle until now had now been replaced by more than enough light to allow him to orient himself with his present perception without any problem. This was in fact already the case as soon as he woke up, or he would not have been able to observe all those animal carcasses. Thinking at full speed, Jake remembered that the blue blood and the crystal of the T-Rex had indeed also started to glow when the night had fallen. During that night, Jake had lost his machete and the crystal a long time ago, but the blood covering his body was an excellent baseline to assess the phenomenon. Now that the sun was rising, it was quite logical and acceptable that the blood of these creatures would cease to emit. Moreover, the fact that the sun was rising meant that he was about to pass his second trial. Who would have thought that an accident like this one would allow him to overcome this second trial, the mystery of which still remained unsolved? With the events of the last 24 hours, he had already gathered some convincing clues, but he was far from having all the answers. Knowing that he had no power in him at the moment, Jake waited patiently, lying on his back for the sun to rise completely. The berserk mode into which the red blood had forcibly plunged him was not without consequences, and the backlash had left him in a critical state. Although he had no apparent injuries except for a few bruises and bites, his body was exhausted and stiff as if all his vital energy had been stolen from him. After what seemed like an endless amount of time, the sun finally rose completely, and the limited visibility was replaced by daylight. One of the nearby trees had been severely damaged in the fighting, probably due to the fall of the giant raptor. An ray of sunlight had managed to make its way to the jungle floor. Without the corrosive smell of blood and viscera, the atmosphere could have felt almost like a fairy tale, but this morning was doomed to remain a nightmare. As Jake waited with growing impatience for the arrival of the artificial voice announcing his success, only silence kept answering him. As time passed, Jake frowned more and more and slowly grew nervous. According to the terms of the test, he should have received an announcement long ago, but this time he was sure that he wasn't under the influence of drugs or hallucinations. Unless I didn't succeed in the mission? Jake speculated as he tried to remember the exact terms of the objective, but he couldn't think of any subtleties. The mission was indeed to survive one night on the island. In that sense, he had done well. So why was the artificial voice refusing to grant him victory? "Jake," she whispered in a small, agitated voice. "What?" he said. "Look behind you." Obediently, Jake, who was still lying on his back, cocked his head back to see what was worrying she so much, but when he saw the thing in question, he almost shat his pants. The owner of the giant charcoal-colored hand was approaching him calmly, each of its steps being as supple and stealthy as a leopard's stride despite its imposing size. It was a bipedal creature, of almost human morphology except that the hulk might have been described as cute next to this monster. More than 12 meters high, with long arms almost reaching to his knees, and a shredded and overdeveloped musculature to the point of seeming unhealthy and alienating. In addition to being completely bald and hairless, pointed ears and two bulging green eyes shining like emeralds were staring menacingly at him. The monster's green eyes with their half-moon-shaped pupils were certainly unnerving, but what caught Jake's attention was the green crystal hanging down around the monster's neck with a crude string. Alas, before Jake could draw any conclusions, the monster was on top of him, and he only had time to catch a huge clawed foot coming down to his face before his consciousness was blasted to oblivion. At least he now understood why he had failed the second trial. What was the point of surviving the night, if it meant dying right afterwards? Of course, the owner of the sanctuary bubble had long since planned a parade for this kind of cheap scheme. Unless he could repeat the feat and ensure his survival in the following days, the only way to pass this second test was still to unravel the mystery of this island. Chapter 247, The Acrobatic John. Gasp. When Jake reopened his eyes, he was back on the white sand beach, and the corpse of the pterodactyl vulture was hovering behind him. Normally, he would have insulted the oracle and his misfortune of all names, but he was not in the mood for that this time. He just felt tired and weary. Even though the conclusion of his last attempt had ended in the same failure, he had nevertheless made significant progress. During his fighting last night, she had continued to collect data despite his unconscious state. The clues he had gathered so far were as follows. There were 3 unique minerals on the island with mysterious properties: flintium, orxanium, and naquat. The red crystal housing the soul of the T-Rex possessed all 3 minerals, but the proportions of each mineral were not known. Orxanium gave a blue color to the blood or sap of certain plants or animals and gave them hallucinogenic and sedative properties. The red blood seemed harmless during the day, but increased the aura and ferocity of the monsters tenfold at nightfall when the blood started to glow. In the morning, the backlash was so severe that most predators emerged extremely weakened and vulnerable from their night fights. Both blue and red blood glowed at night. There was not a single creature on the island that did not possess one of these 2 types of blood. Despite their incredible effects, his status had never displayed any poisoning condition of any kind. No chemical reaction in his body indicated that he was under the influence of any poison. However, it was clear that his consciousness and spirit body had been severely affected on each occasion. Lastly, the last clue was this green stone around the monster's neck that finished him off last night. It was the only creature on the island in his memories that had green eyes and possessed such a stone. It was also the only predator of his knowledge that hunted in the morning despite having a crippling weakness when exposed to sunlight. There were still many unknowns, such as the role of flintium and naquat, and the reason for such differences in the properties of these materials between day and night, but he felt he was close. Roar. The hybrid roar of the feathered T-Rex pulled him out of his thoughts, and seconds later he witnessed the expected arrival of the hungry dinosaur, which uprooted a few palm trees as it had done on previous occasions. Already tired of this trial, Jake strangled the T-Rex with his telekinetic grip, but instead of dragging the monster to him in order to lure the predator with the green stone, he decided to take the lead this time. It was clear that this humanoid monster was the main obstacle in this trial. If this creature had been eliminated, perhaps he could have survived the morning of his previous attempt. After all the red-blooded animals were in a similar state, and the blue-blooded animals were lethargic during the day, as demonstrated by the snake, which only attacked him after being sliced in half by his machete. The T-Rex seemed to be an exception, no doubt thanks to the crystal that protected its soul, but it nevertheless remained weaker than the level of prowess expected from such a carnivore at the top of the food chain. Meow? The shrill sound between a meow and a canary's call was heard a couple of seconds later, and Jake understood that he had only a short period of time to act. Leaving the T-Rex unconscious and rotting on the spot, Jake leapt about 10 meters to the top of the nearest palm tree, and then with some extra acrobatics reached the high branch of a tree a little further into the jungle. The foliage was dense, but its position was ideal for ambushing the greenstone predator. As Jake waited eagerly for the humanoid giant to arrive, he felt a rustle not far away, but luckily it turned out to be just a sleeping parrot. The bird was about 5 feet tall, with red, green, and blue plumage, but its attitude was completely carefree in its presence. Sleeping upright, the sound it heard was only the bird spreading its wings briefly to stretch. Why is this shit still alive and fine? Jake was partially skeptical of the bird's lack of alertness, but that was not his concern for now. While Jake waited with increasing tension for his opponent's arrival, the parrot continued to drowse without concern for its environment. The footsteps of the greenstone monster were almost impossible to pick up, but the same could not be said for the trees uprooted by the creature's passage. The characteristic sound of collapsing shrubs and snapping vines were perfectly audible, as were the monster's abnormal cries that were causing quite a racket. That this parrot was still able to sleep peacefully at this point was almost a miracle. About a minute later, the charcoal-colored silhouette of the humanoid monster appeared in his field of vision, and Jake recognized the green stone around the creature's neck. Defeating this monster was his primary goal, but if he failed, getting the stone was an absolute necessity. Resembling an emerald the size of a tennis ball full of impurities, its appearance was distinct from the red crystal inlaid in the forehead of the T-Rex, which was instead sparkling, pure, and shaped like a precious piece of jewelry. One had been extracted manually by primitive means and was unprocessed, while the other was clearly the result of advanced technology. Crouching on his branch, Jake slowly unfurled his claws, and his body gradually warmed up, while taking care not to emit any light. He also refrained from deploying his spirit body to scan for etheric signatures around him so as not to attract the creature's attention. It was also for this reason that he had not noticed the parrot's presence until it made a movement. After last night, he realized that his ether control was not invincible on this island, and that most creatures here seemed to be sensitive to spiritual auras. In other words, when he detected an enemy through his spirit body, he took the risk of being detected as well. If Jake knew of more advanced ether-based mental techniques, it would undoubtedly have been possible to spy on his enemies unsuspectingly, including humans with mental stats similar to his, but unfortunately this was not yet the case. 5 meters, 4 meters, 3 meters. When the humanoid monster passed under Jake's branch, he stopped breathing and even stopped his heartbeat for fear of ruining everything. With his agility and perception, it was doable for a short while. Luckily, it turned out that the giant predator was not particularly sharp despite his long, pointed ears. Either its hearing was bad or the creature was abnormally relaxed. However, on second thought, Jake thought it was perfectly normal. At this time of day, most of the dangerous animals on the island must have been in a critically weakened state or sleeping soundly like the parrot next to him. The charcoal-colored predator was therefore the king of the jungle during this early morning hour. Once the monster walked past him without showing any sign that his presence had been noticed, Jake let himself fall from his branch without a sound and landed noiselessly on the monster's neck. In a gesture repeated mentally hundreds of times over the last minute, Jake crossed his glowing claws around the monster's throat and uncrossed them with a sharp jerk. A shower of green blood sprayed the flowers at the foot of the monster, but a horrible screeching of metal against metal was also heard. Far from being slit cleanly as Jake had hoped, the monster uttered a long, raging wail and began to shake itself around to get rid of the parasite on its back. The parasite in question was hanging on somehow, using his extraordinary balance to swing back and forth and right and left without tipping over completely. Realizing that this tactic did not work, the monster suddenly performed a backflip on the spot. A giant over 10 meters tall doing a backflip was so unexpected and unbelievable for Jake that he only had time to raise his arms to protect his face before hitting the ground hard, as if he had just been catapulted. Cough, cough. Fuck. Jake spat out a clump of dirt and several teeth with great difficulty, but it was not the time to mourn. Rolling sideways, he narrowly avoided being trampled by the monster again. Then by pushing on his arms, he managed to roll backwards and fall back on his feet. His lips were swollen and his nose and mouth were bleeding, but that was the least of his worries at that moment. The giant monster was raving mad, and his wheezing breath indicated that Jake's failed ambush had not been in vain. The monster's throat had been slit, but the wound was not deep enough and the bleeding had already stopped. More importantly, Jake's scratch had served its secondary purpose. The string holding the green stone had been severed, and the green stone was now in his hand. Chapter 248 Naquat or. With no intention of letting the thief rejoice, a huge clawed foot rushed straight to Jake's face, stirring up a gust of wind, as if the giant was about to take a penalty whose ball was his head. Eyes bulging with fear, Jake dived into the ground by sheer reflex, narrowly dodging the lethal kick. Once underground, he fled without a second thought. Actively controlling the earth around him, he escaped at missile speed, leaving the giant monster helpless. Even for this creature, the vegetation was just too dense, and there was nothing it could do to catch up with this insolent prey. Besides, it had no idea in which direction this thief had fled. As soon as Jake had gone beyond the reach of his senses, his etheric signature had disappeared, and his movements underground had the virtue of being perfectly silent. In less than 5 minutes, Jake had widened the distance to about 15 kilometers, and he only stopped when he almost rammed into a huge boulder. Believing that he was safe now, he cautiously climbed to the surface and turned around. Like a badly driven nail, his head emerged above the ground, peeling off a patch of weeds at the same time. Rotating his head swiftly to the left and right, and then above him, he made sure there were no dangerous beasts in the vicinity. Behind him stood the boulder, so he had nothing to fear from behind. Jake heaved a sigh of relief when he didn't detect any presence. After his misadventure with the snake, he now double-checked before concluding that any piece of wood was indeed a snake, but the place where he had landed was all clear, probably because of the huge rock that had forced him to stop. Apart from a few weeds and bushes here and there was hardly anything. It was also the first place he discovered in the jungle where the foliage of the trees could not cover the sunlight. The rock, which was about a dozen meters long, filled the space where a giant tree should have been. As a result, the sun's rays scattered their light there, effectively shielding him from retaliation by the humanoid monster roaming in the jungle. Jake was surprised that no animals had come to seek shelter here, but upon analyzing his surroundings, he soon found his answer. Even though this small sunny lawn area looked like a little piece of paradise in the middle of this hostile jungle, it was sadly not so easy to get there. Around the rock, the density of brambles and creepers was such that with the exception of a few small mammals, birds, or insects, it was impossible to discover this natural clearing. Snakes had a chance with patience, but the scarcity of prey and the fact that only flying animals could get here easily made this place unsuitable for hunting. Indeed, if there was one thing Jake had noticed about this island, it was that birds were not the weakest link in the food chain. Their size was usually close to an airplane, and the smallest bird he had met was that parrot he had seen a few minutes before, with its wings spread out. Even this harmless-looking sleeping parrot could have a wingspan of up to 4 meters. Far from being sheltered here, a snake would have been a vulnerable prey for these aerial predators. Add to this the fact that few mammals could reach this place, and these snakes and other predators capable of coming here would most often prefer to stay away from it. At last certain that he was out of danger, Jake popped out of his hole and took the opportunity to analyze the booty in his hand. The green stone did indeed look like an emerald full of impurity coming straight out of the mine, but it didn't matter. As long as he had his bracelet, he could easily analyze it as if geology was his own field of expertise. Naquat or with a crystalline structure and unique properties in the mirror universe. It is a material with mediating properties that is particularly sought after in the design of many advanced technologies. Because of its revitalizing properties for the soul and the fact that its radiation can easily neutralize external influences, good or bad, on the mind. This mineral is also called green soul stone in the jargon of the mirror universe. This mineral contains many secrets. Jake continued to scroll down the report in search of more information, but as usual the oracle system showed how stingy he could be. It was clear that his bracelet had retained many details, and he could only blame his oracle rank for being too low. Nevertheless, there were some crucial revelations in those few sentences, and if that was what he thought, he had probably found a solution to this second trial. Something was telling him that the humanoid giant would not have such a good night this time, unless he could get a new soul stone before nightfall. Handling the stone in his hand with care, Jake carefully inspected the object with his own senses in vain. It was only when he connected his consciousness to the Naquat, or that he got a reaction. Under the lucid scrutiny of his spirit body, the soul stone seemed to harbor a mysterious energy that was extremely compatible with his soul. This energy was produced slowly but at a constant rate, but no matter what he tried, he was unable to extract it from the rock. This stone seemed to follow a specific cycle that he was not able to influence at his level. However, after creating this mental connection with the object, Jake felt his mental fatigue diminish in a distinct way, as if he had been wearing a vice around his skull until now and it had suddenly been removed. He could only feel better after that. When he inspected his stats, he found that his extrasensory perception and intelligence ether were showing signs of growth, as was his spirit body. The effect was minimal, but in the long run it might result in a big difference. In other words, he had struck gold, and if he wasn't in a simulation, he would definitely have been the happiest person in the world. The idea that this soul stone was fake was extremely discouraging. In any case, his predicament had probably been solved by the acquisition of this stone. The ability to ward off any outside influences on the mind seemed to match his need precisely. He had already been able to confirm that he had not been poisoned on the previous 3 nights, but each time his consciousness had been strongly altered, leaving crucial after effects on his body and mind that had led each time to his death, either directly or indirectly. Although the day was just beginning, Jake had no intention of taking any risks. Because it was the time he used to roast the pterodactyl, his belly soon began to rumble, but he held his nerve. If camping on this rock for 1 night allowed him to confirm his hypothesis and validate his second trial, he was quite willing to do without meals for a day. Moreover, he did not need to eat. Deciding to try his accelerated healing skill, Jake buried himself underground with the Naquat stone in fetal position and proceeded to nap until the next morning. Putting things into perspective, his body had just been fighting in the ocean for over a week, and he definitely needed a rest. This small clearing also had the added benefit of satisfactory exposure to the sun, and burying himself underground in a sunny space was currently the Cantharians' preferred means of strengthening their bodies or healing from their injuries. No matter what the next event was going to be, he wanted to face it in the best possible conditions. Once underground, he immersed his consciousness inside the soul stone, not without keeping a sliver of attention on the rest of his environment in case of an unexpected guest. Slowly, time passed, and soon the day gave way to night. The sun's rays were replaced by the negligible brightness of a few distant stars, and the temperature dropped sharply by several degrees. The soul stone in the palm of his hand suddenly began to radiate a mysterious green light, and the hitherto inaccessible energy inside the earth suddenly began to surge through him. The stone's radiance seemed to be unhindered by any physical obstacle, and he understood instinctively that he was not the only living being to benefit from these effects. What was the real scope of influence of this stone? Unfortunately, he had no way to verify this. What he did know, though, was that he could channel this flow of energy onto himself. When he tested his hypothesis, the stone stopped glowing, but Jake felt the fog enveloping his consciousness dissipate with a feeling of enlightenment comparable to what a child may feel when holding himself on his bike without any help for the first time. His spirit body and mental stats grew at a rapid rate, but the mysterious energy inside the stone also declined rapidly. Unlike the day when the energy seemed to be generated on a constant basis, the production at night had slowed down to a crawl, and if it continued like this, the stone's energy would be depleted in less than 30 minutes. If this happened, he would be much less confident in his chances of surviving until the morning. So Jake forced himself to conserve the remaining energy stored in the stone, and having nothing better to do, he chose to go back to sleep. The not-so-distant angry cries of the monsters were unable to disrupt him. The not-so-distant furious cries of the monsters sounded like a lullaby to him, and he slept like a baby. In the morning, when the sun rose again, the long-awaited artificial voice resounded above him, and he knew that he had finally passed the second trial. Chapter 249 Battle Royale. While Jake was still snuggled comfortably underground, the artificial voice proceeded to announce its verdict on his performance during this second trial. Congratulations, Jake Wilderth, for being the 7,216th contestant to survive a night on the island in just 17 days, 0 hours, 13 minutes, and 48 seconds. 50,000 points for passing the second trial. 0 bonus points for not being among the top 5,000. As he pulled himself out of the ground, Jake continued to pay attention in the hope that some potential exploits would be announced, but he soon gave up. If it was true that he had defeated A.T. Rex, the only night he had actually accomplished a massacre was the night of his third attempt. In other words, on his last attempt, he had simply snatched the green stone from its owner, then shamelessly fled underground and literally holed up without taking any risks until the next morning. Seen in this way, his performance during this second trial could only be considered mediocre, even if at this point in the ordeal what really mattered was to still be in the running. Considering the time he had wasted during his first trial in the ocean, and the fact that he was the 7,216th participant to successfully spend a night on the island, it didn't take a genius to deduce that there were less than 10,000 participants still alive in this sanctuary bubble. After all, he was the 10,127th participant to reach the shore a few days earlier, and considering that he was one of the last, if not the last to make it, it was clear that the number of players had plummeted drastically during those few days. That didn't mean that 3,000 players had given up. Apart from the lucky few who had the ability to precisely target the flaws of the first event, most of them had had to start over many times or were already extremely strong. It was virtually impossible for these participants to give up after a few successive failures. The logical conclusion was that out of these 3,000 participants, a good number were simply still stuck in the second trial, unable to solve the mystery. Considering the hardships that a man like Jake had faced before finding a solution, it was easy to imagine what the average player had to endure. Jake also realized that this artificial voice seemed to only take into account the feats he had accomplished during his last attempt, the one that ended in success. This explained why some extraordinary feats during his first trial had not been rewarded. He had in mind, for example, the fact that he had swum in the ocean depths or fought all kinds of strange creatures in deep water that neither the voice nor the oracle system had announced. Indeed, if he had touched the ocean floor several times and even discovered the enormous indestructible or covering the seabed, the truth was that each time his snorkeling had been nothing more than a one-way trip. He had never gotten enough air to come back up to the surface. It was therefore normal that the achievement was never credited to him. Jake did not think that these feats were useless, however, since reaching the ocean floor was a feat in itself, and it was impossible for the sanctuary bubble to ignore it. He only hoped that it would be the same with this second trial, even though his performance was comparatively much more trivial. While he was wondering about the course of the future events, the artificial voice cut short his reflection. The third stage will begin shortly, in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. When the countdown reached 0, a strange sensation ran through his body. It was the same kind of feeling that one might get when a plane accelerated steeply during takeoff or when an elevator started to operate a little abruptly. He felt his body being inexplicably compressed, but his internal organs also yo-yoed as if he had just been shaken around like a maracas. Yet he hadn't moved, and the ground under his feet hadn't changed either. Still, when he concentrated again on his surroundings, his eyes bulged uncontrollably. The landscape around him may have been identical in almost every way to the one a few seconds earlier, but he instinctively knew on a gut level that the situation had changed. His body, the grass under his feet, the warmth of the sun, the smells, even the saturation of colors. Everything felt real now. Until then he hadn't realized it, as if his mind had been in a kind of lucid dream from the start. Even though he knew that everything was fake, he was unable to pinpoint why. But now that he was awake, it was more than simple to point out all the discrepancies. At that very moment, Jake was overwhelmed by an indisputable certainty. It was no longer a simulation, and he was now on a real island identical in almost every way to the one he had just left. He couldn't be sure, but he was absolutely positive that if he were to die here, his second ordeal would come to an end. No wonder the sanctuary bubble had refused to validate his second trial in the previous attempt. If he had really been sent to this island with his real body, it would have been like committing suicide for no reason given his critical weakened condition back then. As if to confirm his suppositions, the artificial voice resounded again and began to introduce the peculiarities of the third trial. The tone was remarkably courteous. First, Congratulations to Jake Wilderth for successfully completing the first 2 trials. The first 2 trials were part of a simulation to prepare you for the third trial. The first trial introduced you to the ocean fauna around the island, while developing your survival skills in a hostile environment and forging your willpower. Anyone who persisted definitely strengthened their soul and spirit bodies significantly and resolved the psychological trauma and phobias typically observed in such situations. If you have not overcome the fear of death, you have definitively overcome the fear of suffering, and if not, at least you know how to disregard it or use it to your advantage. The purpose of the second trial was to introduce you to the dangers of the island, but above all to give you time to understand by yourself how to survive there. There are many places in the mirror universe or beyond that are even more mysterious and hostile, and it was imperative that as young players you became aware of them. If this happens to you in the future, you won't have this simulation to prepare for it, and we hope that this invaluable experience will serve as a memorable lesson for you. These 2 preliminary trials of the simulation thus bring us to the objective of the third trial, which marks the beginning of the second phase, the Battle Royale. The objective of the third trial is as follows: to survive on the island until the descent of the Phantom Sanctuary and to enter it. The Phantom Sanctuary will only accept 100 participants. Jake was shocked silly for a brief moment. Knowing that there were more than 11 million participants at the start, and that there were currently only 7,000 still in the running, 100 places were a ridiculously low number. It was clear that the Sanctuary bubble wanted them to kill each other. The functions of the Sanctuary bubble that were previously deactivated or hidden will now be turned on. The feats feature, the player rankings, as well as the exploration feature are now enabled. When the artificial voice uttered these words, Jake, who was already aware of the feats category, suddenly discovered that 2 more features had just been added. In addition, the category corresponding to his feats now displayed much more information, and he could now directly access a list of all the feats waiting to be accomplished on the island and the rewards expected upon their completion. The same was true for the exploration feature, which contained many achievements, such as exploring the seabed, for example, but also many submissions similar to quests. The island was gigantic and seemed to hold an infinite number of secrets. As for the player rankings, this was the most important aspect of this third event. In addition to showing how many points each player had scored and their respective names and species, it also showed which competitor was still in the running and which was already dead. Another important detail was the number of murders that each player had committed, and since Jake's murder count was still 0, it was clear that the murders were not related to the killing of animals. There was still the possibility that the counter had been reset at the beginning of this third event, but in view of the low scores and the nature of this third trial, it was more prudent to treat each participant as an enemy. As he was about to look at the rankings in more detail, the artificial voice spoke one last time before finally shutting up for good. Good luck. May fate work in your favor. Jake remained skeptical about this last announcement, but he soon regained his poise. It was similar to the encouragement formula used by the Oracle system at the beginning of each ordeal. He had noticed that after passing the first 2 tests, the artificial voice had ceased to be robotic and indifferent and now seemed to show him a form of respect, as if getting this far was enough to prove that he was different from the rest of the herd. It was with this encouragement that Jake embarked on this new challenge. And while he was peacefully familiarizing himself with the specifics of the event, elsewhere on the island many participants were fighting for their lives. Chapter 250 Tim's Misadventures. Pant. Thousands of miles from Jake's position, a young teenager was running for his life, huffing and puffing. His tousled brown hair had grown well since the ordeal began, but the immature features of his face were still recognizable. It was no more and no less than Tim. Except that since his excellent performance in the first trial, when he was the 996th competitor to reach the shore, the situation had changed. His composed but vigilant expression was over. On his face there was nothing but endless distress and deep despair. His frail and underdeveloped muscles were trembling with exhaustion, and Tim had stopped sweating long ago. His tongue was hanging down, his breathing was wheezing, and his lips were bluish as if he was about to faint. He didn't know how he was still standing, but he knew that if he flinched for even a second, his ordeal would end. Boom! Panicked, the child turned his head briefly behind his shoulder, and the sight that appeared before his eyes almost caused him to drop dead of a heart attack. The brambles, creepers, and bushes he had dodged with the greatest difficulty had been vaporized by intense heat, and the ground behind him had been reduced to smoking lava. Shit, Tim cursed, his body being seized by an irrepressible shiver of terror. Frightened, a rush of adrenaline from deep within him gave his exhausted body a burst of vigor. As if he had just taken a doping drug, the young boy started running again, determined to make it through. After he had already disappeared in the middle of another labyrinth of bushes and brambles, a humanoid shape about 2.5 meters high walked calmly on the molten ground, indifferent to the heat below him, which was over 1,000 degrees Celsius. Shortly afterwards, two other creatures of similar appearance, but of slightly more frail stature, appeared behind the first one, each standing to its right and left. Krish, this prey is too troublesome. It is as if it can anticipate our movements, and the environment seems to play in its favor. The humanoid creature on the right grunted in an annoyed tone. Krish, but that's what makes hunting fun. The tougher the prey, the more it deserves our attention. The individual on the left roared with intense passion, never refusing a good challenge. Krish, true. The alien in the middle, who hadn't uttered a word from the beginning, suddenly raised a clawed hand covered with a sort of gauntlet in a mysterious alloy. Seeing their leader's gesture, the other two aliens stopped whining. Satisfied to have captured their attention, the humanoid creature at the head of this trio proposed an alternative. Krish, both of you are right. Hunting is more fun when the prey resists, but it is true that our time here is not unlimited. There are many feats and missions to accomplish on this island if we want to keep our advantage. On the other hand, if the prey is really worth it, it will survive until the descent of the Phantom Sanctuary. If it is the case, we will meet it again. In this case, we might as well let it flee for the moment. What do you think? The individual on the right immediately showed its support for this brilliant idea, but the alien on the left remained silent for a long time, scratching its chin. If its face wasn't so different from a human, a trained eye could have read frustration, but also a form of defiance. Krish, and our honor in all this. Never should a Krish let a prey escape him. I will fight alone if I have to. The other two aliens let the alien on the left get it off his chest, but he seemed to have accumulated an astronomical amount of resentment and grievances about all its decisions as a leader. Its pride far outstripped its common sense, and it had been raised in the purest Krish tradition. Tired of its whining, the alien in the center raised its hand again to silence it. Then, as if it had just come up with a great idea, its multifaceted yellow eyes lit up, and it said, Krish, do you want to continue the hunt? Not knowing what its leader was getting at, the alien on the left simply shrugged. Krish. Yes. Krish. Ha ha ha. In that case, I have a simple idea. Let's split up. You continue to hunt the hairless gnome, and we take care of the other objectives in the meantime. What do you say? The alien on the left felt that something was wrong with this proposal, but when its leader patted him on the shoulder twice with increasing pressure on his collarbone, it just swallowed its saliva and nodded in agreement with its leader's proposal. Challenging the authority of their boss was a very bad idea, and it was not confident in its ability to survive an altercation with their leader. In their society, positions of authority were occupied by the most illustrious warriors with the best genes and achievements of their species. An inferior caste warrior like him had no hope in a frontal confrontation. The trio having reached an agreement, the leader and the alien on the right dashed off in another direction while the remaining alien, abandoned by its companions, shifted its attention to the bushes where the child had disappeared. For several minutes, Tim continued to run like a madman until his last burst of energy ran out. When he stumbled against a root because his tired, heavy leg refused to take another step forward, he knew he was a goner. Yet, while he expected to be caught any second, his danger sense skill remained silent. I survived. Stuttering those words, even Tim couldn't believe it. But the facts were there. Those who were chasing him had ceased pursuing him. Nevertheless, he noticed that his sense of danger was not completely dormant. The threat behind him had not completely disappeared. It was simply less urgent. Knowing that if he stayed there, he would soon be in danger again, the boy forced himself up and began to limp slowly towards another mass of brambles and bushes. This was far from a solution, but it would make it more difficult for his pursuers. As he contorted himself between the brambles, alternating between crawling and groveling, he could not help but recall the facts that had led him to this awful situation. Even after he had reached the shore, the second trial had not been too difficult for him. Although he had exhausted his luck in the first trial, an afternoon's rest on the beach had allowed him to recover his ether of luck without exposing himself to the slightest danger. Like Jake, he had tried to spend the first night on the beach in vain, but when he had realized that the solution was in the jungle, he had simply used his natural luck to fumble his way to the destination holding the answer. It had taken several attempts, but with his luck several times better than normal and his innate luck skill, which could boost his luck against equivalent temporary bad luck, he had quickly solved the case. On the fifth day, Tim had discovered a clearing where sparkling green grass was growing and a herd of giant deer were grazing peacefully. As unlikely as this setting may seem, he had immediately felt his heart calm and his mental fatigue subside. Even his good luck had quickly recovered, giving him the opportunity to use his innate luck skill again. Unsurprisingly, he had camped in this lost clearing until nightfall, and the grass and plants around him had soon given off a bright green light. Each time a rabid predator approached this green light, he would briefly regain its lucidity or, on the contrary, become even crazier. But each time, the giant deer stood united in the face of the threat, and Tim didn't have to get his hands dirty. In the end, he had spent a wonderful night, and the artificial voice had resounded the next morning to declare his success. He was then the 2,216th participant to reach the real island. And it was at that very moment that the real hell had begun for him. Because when he had arrived on the island, things were quite different. The herd of giant deer defending the clearing was absent, and Tim had to face the fact that he hadn't eaten or drunk since the beginning of the ordeal. Predictably, he had been left with no choice but to explore the island during the day, but unlike the previous two trials, there was no room for error anymore. Cautious by nature, Tim would flee whenever his danger sense gave him the slightest warning. At night, he would return to hide in the clearing. Alas, no prey on this island was an easy prey. To survive, he had fed mainly on insects and berries, but not enough to maintain his weight. On the 11th day, a giant humanoid with charcoal-colored skin had suddenly burst into the clearing and claimed the site with a deafening meow. Tim had been forced to flee, and his ordeal had been a nightmare ever since. A few hours earlier, he had discovered a new clearing similar to the previous one and was overjoyed. Who would have thought that he had just escaped from one hellhole to jump into an even worse one? For the new clearing was already occupied by 3 aliens.